Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank, episode number 40, Big 4-0. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host today. I'm going to be your Pack One, Pick One today. And joining me on the wheel, we have, Chris is off doing Chris things, so he's not going to be joining us today. But we do have Teld with us, and Teld brought a special guest by the name of Salmonella with him. So hopefully, hopefully one of these days we can have a Jank Tank episode where at least one of the hosts is not sick with some sort of life-threatening thing going on. It feels like for the past month somebody's been sick on every single recording. But Teld, you tell me you're doing a little bit better today than you were the last couple days.
Yeah, I woke up and was able to move today, so that was great. Yesterday, I was laid out on the couch literally all day. You probably single digit number of minutes off the couch.
Yeah, we were just chatting about Salmonella stories before this, but we'll spare the reader some of those. I will say my summary of that is just don't eat at Subway, people. Like, avoid Subway, like the actual plague. I know that's like a thing people like to say, but it might have literally been the plague a couple of years ago. But yeah, thanks for joining me, buddy. We'll have to, Chris might not have been super interested in talking about this episode. And Chris, if you're listening, I love you, but I almost like that this topic lines up with Chris not being here, because I know he's a hater of a lot of this stuff. So like, we're trying to frame this as a positive thing, and I'm not sure if Chris could like straight face have a positive discussion about what we're going to talk about today. So
yeah, if you're one of the people who've been listening for a while, we did a rant bonus episode a ways back about digital cards, but this is going to be a much more level-headed and positive view on it. I think they've at least for us, they've gotten some goodwill out of the last couple of sets for us.
Yeah, so obviously if you're here, you're listening to this, you saw the title, like the A word. We're going to talk about the A word, alchemy, and we're going to say good things about alchemy. We're going to say bad things about alchemy, but we're going to mostly frame this as a positive discussion about digital magic on Arena and alchemy and so on. And I assume like only 3 people are still listening at this point, because the stigma against alchemy is so bad. Like, it is just alchemy equals bad in the minds of the community. And I get that. I get where people are coming from. But like, hear us out. We're doing an episode, a mainline episode here to talk about like what alchemy can do for your cube, and part of this does apply to paper magic as well. So don't dismiss this completely. Listen to what we have to say about it. Maybe we can convince you, maybe we can't. There are some people who will not budge on the alchemy discussion no matter what.
So I have an idea, Tim. When you do the YouTube video, have some bookmarks, so that way the people who only want to hear alchemy bad just have a tags of alchemy bad whenever we're talking about it. They can just skip through the episode and ignore all the good things and just hear us talk bad about alchemy.
Or what if I find one of those bleep sound effects, and every time we say alchemy we just bleep over it? It really is like a taboo word in Magic. Remember, it was, what's the current like Sky is Fallen thing? Universes Beyond, probably, right? Do you remember when they announced digital only cards on Arena? Like, that was the biggest Sky is Fallen thing since like The Walking Dead or whatever.
I'm not gonna lie, I was actually one of the 5% of the community that was like, hey, this is really, really cool, and I'm kind of glad that they're doing this. Now, granted, at the time, Standard was a garbage fire, so the idea of rebalanced cards was really cool, and the idea of some digital only mechanics were really cool. And the idea that they could fix things that were problematic was cool. I don't think that Alchemy lived up to what they claimed it to be. I haven't touched the format in a long time. It's a huge dump for wild cards, even relative to regular Magic. But yeah. I think I was part of the very small percentage of the community that was actually on board with the idea, if not the execution of it.
Yeah, we should be very clear. Actually, I should clarify this from the beginning for anyone who's like hasn't left us yet. We're not talking about the format alchemy. Like, that'll come up in discussion. We're talking about digital only cards that have been created on Arena. We have no intent. We don't give a shit about the alchemy format, like as a constructed format.
We play very small numbers of constructed games around here.
Okay, so before we get too deep into this, let's go ahead and get our housekeeping out of the way here. I do want to remind the fine folks that the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join the Discord server, come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, all things Magic. A lot of peasant Cube discussion going on in the server these days, though this discussion about alchemy will not fully be peasant-oriented. We're talking about kind of the whole whole shebang here. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We host tons of scheduled drafts throughout the week, including our Peasant Cube on Saturday nights and actually Monday afternoons recently. The mainline Jank Diver Cube is on Sunday nights and occasionally on Wednesdays. We have F&M style drafts on Fridays where our players vote on a cube to play. I will say those ones have been a little bit wishy-washy lately. We've had just under the right number of people to fire those, but hey, if people want to come out and do some F&M drafting on Arena, we're here for it. And we have various guest cubes created by members of our server throughout the week, so there's always plenty to do. In fact, I think our guest cube today is from Oofies, who is firing off his debut of Outlaws of Thunder Junction kind of set cube, like a rework peasant version of OTJ, which looks and sounds amazing to me. I don't know how OTJ plays if you take all the rares out of it, because that was kind of a feature of the set. But
I always wonder with these remastered sets that people have been getting into lately. Like with our Neo set, it's very much a peasant set. Like that format was very paupery. All the best cards for the most part were low rarity. I always wonder with these princely sets. OTJ is a great set, but like you said, it does revolve really heavily around the rares. So it'd be interesting to see what happens there.
Yeah, I have a lot of faith in Oofies, who's a good player, being able to put together a good cube. So we'll see. Hopefully they get the people to fire that off, and he can get some feedback on it and adjust it over time. But it's a cool concept. We've actually had quite a few people present these reworked limited environments minus rares. We've seen people do it for Eldraine. Obviously, you guys have Neo Cube. A lot of cool stuff from the community there.
Yeah, I saw that the cube only had 2 Cactarantulas, so that can't be correct, because every OTJ deck that I ever played against had 3 of them, so I don't know what we're going to do there.
I'll bring Cactarantula back up in the sign-off today. Check out our socials. Find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, or find us on X, I guess is what I'm supposed to be saying now, on JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming occasionally when he's not laid up in bed on twitch.tv/Teld Talks, TELD Talks. Again, Alchemy, stay with us. They're a positive thing. I promise you, you can get more out of this format, or rather out of the digital only cards, than you think. Especially this is going to appeal 95% to people who create and play cubes on Arena. Because obviously that's where digital magic matters. But we'll have a little bit of a discussion about paper magic as well in a little bit. But single card discussion. There were a ton of Alchemy cards we could talk about that a lot of people might have never seen in their life. But I wanted to bring up the one that I think has persisted in our cube, or in our cubes rather, and that's a Dragonfly Pilot, which has been a mainstay of our Peasant Cube since Neo came out. So I'm going to read this card real quick, because it's going to kind of introduce a little bit of a discussion about Alchemy and, what you can do with some Alchemy cards. But Dragonfly Pilot came out in the Neo Kamigawa batch of Alchemy cards, and it is a single white mana for a 1/1 uncommon Fox Pilot. And it says, when Dragonfly Pilot enters the battlefield, conjure a card named Dragonfly Suit into your hand. And it also has the dumb pilot text of it can crew vehicles as though its power were 2 greater or whatever, which is a really weird thing to put on a card that conjures a crew 1 vehicle. But as a reminder, Dragonfly Suit is an actual paper card that was in the Kamigawa set, the mainline set. It is 2 and a white for a 3/2 flying vehicle with crew 1. So not a very good card. You would never put Dragonfly Suit in a cube. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Dragonfly Suit is not in your guys' Neo Reloaded cube, right? It would never.
That's correct. Yeah, it was nowhere near good enough to be in that cube.
Yeah, it's just not a good card. But the way Conjure works, by the way, is you just create that card. It's kind of like creating a token in paper, but it's an actual card. So it goes to your hand. If you cast it, it goes to the battlefield. If it dies, it goes to the graveyard. It's basically creating a game object, an actual card within the game. That's what Conjure does. So we're talking about a 1-mana 1/1 that makes this Dragonfly Suit. And it turns out Dragonfly Suit, as a bonus card that you get off of an ETB from a 1-drop creature, actually makes the card a little bit more playable. And this is what I love that Alchemy does. I think this is one of the strong points of Alchemy that'll come up later, is giving you an opportunity to play with cards that basically have 0 home ever. Dragonfly Suit is a card that would never go in anybody's cube, But Dragonfly Pilot is a good enough card as a 1-mana 1/1 that creates another game object and lets you play with this just completely forgotten dud of a card, right? Dragonfly Suit, when you get it for free, when you get to create it and you don't have to use a cube slot on the card Dragonfly Suit, turns out much better of a card when it's basically a 1-mana 1/1 that cantrips into this card every single time. I love Dragonfly Pilot. It's been a mainstay of our Peasant Cube. I think it might be the only Alchemy card that's actually still in our Peasant Cube, but this is the type of thing that we miss out on if we say, okay, 0 Alchemy. We're never touching Alchemy. Alchemy equals bad. We miss out on a card like this that I think actually fills a really good gap in our Peasant Cube of like good ETB 1-drops for aggressive decks in particular. You know, you have your Thraben Inspector, your Novice Inspector, which can go in every white deck, but Dragonfly Pilot really excels in aggro decks because it just gives you an evasive thing to do on turn 3, which I think is very relevant.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite Alchemy designs, and they've been messing around with this a lot more lately, which is to put a cheap card that conjures an unplayable card. And so, like, the idea is, you know, you get this understated or mediocrely statted creature. It's like a 2-mana 2/1 or a 1-mana 1/1 or something like that. And then it makes a card that's also unplayable. But the total combination of what you're getting makes the cards themselves worthwhile. And usually they have some sort of extra synergy, like Dragonfly Pilot, if you happen to have other vehicles, can crew as if it's 2 power greater. So if you've got any sort of extra vehicles or vehicle theming or anything like that, obviously it's better at doing that. But just being able to make the Dragonfly Suit, and this is the kind of card also that would be difficult to do in paper, right? Because if you just like made a Dragonfly Suit token for 1 mana, that'd be actually pretty busted, right? But because of the way Magic works, you can't put a token into your hand. And so you could have maybe some sort of like incubate style mechanic where you had to put some more mana into it first. But I think regardless of how you slice it, this is a mechanic that's just much cleaner to do using the digital aspect of Magic. And this is not a broken card by any means. It's not something that's pushing the power level. It's not one of the top 5 or 10 white cards in the cube. It's just a good role player.
No, yeah, it's not a top card, but in the Peasant Cube, when you're playing against like, you know, Boros aggro is probably its best home, and somebody plays this on turn 1, like you kind of feel it, right? Like, you know that first off, they're just up a card. It's like they played a Spirited Companion on 1 instead of 2. You always know what that card is. It's not an exceptional card, but they got it kind of for free, and it is an evasive creature, right? Dragonfly Suit is an evasive creature that can hit you in the air for 3. This is one of the cards that I just really, really like. I'm actually like kind of enamored by the conjure cards that let you play with like these really rinky-dink things that like are just lost to history. Those are kind of my favorite ones. We'll talk about a few more later on, but I wanted to pinpoint this because it's been in our Peasant Cube for upwards of 3+ years now, and it has been a great role player. If I were to recreate the Jank Evergaming Peasant Cube in paper, I would find a way to make this actually work. I think it is that important or that good of a card in our current model that I would try to find a way to make this work. And I'll talk about how to make this work in paper later on as well.
Okay, yeah, if you want to sandbag that for later, that's totally fine. Yeah, I think this card is just excellent, and it sort of feels like the kind of design where they looked at a card that maybe they wish was a little better in Neo Kamigawa, and were like, how do we make this playable? Which is pretty good backwards design. If I would assume that's how this card came to be, is sort of a backwards design of how do we make a Dragonfly Suit playable.
So yeah, a cool little card. I actually highly recommend people who are playing in the digital space try this card out, especially if you have like artifact synergies, blink synergies, a vehicle package, or if you just want a Boros aggro card that's like a natural 2-for-1. I think this is a solid little card that you're missing out on if you just have the blanket like no alchemy ever like type thing. You are missing out on a few cards like this.
Also, Vespral Arc, Lively Dirge type stuff. Really good with those.
Oh, yeah. Oh, nice little 1-drop to get back with your Lively Dirge. It sacrifices to Ruthless Wallbreaker very, very well, as it turns out. Okay, so the overall theme of this episode is how can digital-only designs affect your cube? Before we get into that, let's ask the question, like, why do this episode now? Because Alchemy has been around for... Man, the first batch of Alchemy cards was Midnight Hunt Alchemy, which was a way bigger batch than we normally get. It was just like a dump of like a bunch of digital-only designs that they clearly had like kind of floating around. But why do an episode on Alchemy 5 years later? I think part of the reason that we want to do this is the latest batch from Alchemy Ether Drift actually has like some really inspired designs in it. and some like actual just straight up Magic the Gathering card, like paper Magic the Gathering cards, and it caught our attention because it's like, oh, they're kind of like blurring the line between paper Magic and Alchemy now, to the point where I kind of have to pay attention to some of the Alchemy stuff, and some of the designs are really good. And we've noticed ever since MKM, we did a rant episode on Murders at Karlov Manor Alchemy because there's just some insanely overpowered stuff in that. But beyond that, Bloomburrow, Duskmourn, they had some really cool designs that caught our attention, to the point where we're like now reconsidering like what Alchemy cards we want to play in our different cubes. And Aetherdrift came out not that long ago, and there were just a lot of really cool designs in it. So it's like, okay, maybe Alchemy is trending towards grokkable, playable cards now that we would actually consider in our cube. And there's a lot more positive things to say about Alchemy, where I think most people have already written it off. So yeah, let's take the bad, like let's talk about the bad part of Alchemy, but let's also like take all that with a grain of salt and, you know, talk about the positive things that this can do for your cube as well. So this will be framed mostly as positive things, though up front we are going to talk about like what went wrong with Alchemy, why is it so hated, you know, why do people avoid it and stuff like that. So
yeah, I think one of the advantages that has been going on in terms of the digital design space is kind of twofold. So firstly, like you said, they're blurring the line. So I think what we've seen is a lot more of them willing to experiment with stuff that they previously refused to put on paper cards. So in rest of game effects, things like secret choice effects that typically they avoid. We've seen even at uncommon in one or two sets here and there, which it's easier to do in digital, but now is clearly something they're willing to experiment with in paper. And on top of that, they've been using substantially less, though not removing it entirely. They've used substantially less perpetual, which I think is one of the most frustrating Alchemy mechanics.
One of the one that doesn't translate to paper Magic very well either. But yeah, they have used certain lines of text in the past on Alchemy cards to justify them being like digital only, usually because it's just something that's easier to track digitally, even though you could do it in paper. But one example of this, Duskmourn had a card called Screamin' Nemesis. You probably know this card quite well. And it has this line of text that says your opponent can't gain life for the rest of the game, which is something they've done in paper, like back in Shadowmoor or something. But that's the type of thing, like a rest of the game effect is something that could be forgotten in paper. So they tend not to do it. And yet they put it on Screamin' Nemesis in a modern day set. So clearly they're like, okay, we can do this in small amounts. But the funny thing is that Duskmourn Alchemy had a card called Welcome the Darkness, which is a perfectly normal paper Magic card that would probably actually see like CEDH play if it were printed. And the only thing about it that was quote unquote digital only was that it had the line of text, you can't gain life for the rest of the game. Which I thought was very weird that was an Alchemy card, but Screamin' Nemesis was in the same exact set, like the paper Magic set. So again, blurring the lines a little bit between like, what are we going to do digitally versus what are we not? Another example, they've used the line of text, activate this only once. We've seen that as justification for a card being digital only, but activate only once is also a line of text that has appeared on quite a few paper cards, like In the Trenches from Brothers War comes to mind, but also the entire exhaust mechanic from Aetherdrift is activate only once.
There was also that one random rat in Bloomburrow that drew a card once.
Yeah, the Threshold rat, right? Which the way they handle that in paper is they usually give you a +1/+1 counter as kind of like a visual marker that you've used the activated ability. But that's not the case with like In the Trenches or anything like that. So it, again, just blurring the line a little bit. Some things that they say are like justifications for a card being digital only are things that they just do in paper now. And I think the gloves were off when Murders at Karlov Manor came out and they printed A Killer Among Us as a paper Magic card, because if you've ever played A Killer Among Us in paper, like that is the biggest tracking issue type card I've ever seen. You have to represent 3 different tokens and you have to secretly name something like that. There's no way that wasn't a digital card that they thought was just super cool and put in the main set. So if you can have cards like that in paper, I believe that you can have some slightly complex tracking things go on in paper. Probably not too much, right? Like you don't want every single card to say something happens for the rest of the game, sure, because then for constructed and playing in paper, you're gonna forget about things. So I like them minimizing like tracking issue type things, but they also keep printing things like, I don't know, the speed mechanic and Tempted by the Ring. So like they do things that are equally complex in paper.
Yeah, I wonder how close we are to paper letting us finally have the if you were the second player mechanic.
Yes.
Because like that feels like one of the easiest things to track. It seems substantially easier than some other mechanics that we've had in paper.
It is, and I'm like a little bit back and forth on that one, and it'll come up later in this discussion as well. But I think those are some of the best alchemy designs in the entirety of what's like offered by digital only Magic. Are these like benefits you get by being the second player, which again, tracking issues in paper, but the cards themselves, I think they're great designs. So yeah, so again, that's kind of all justification for why we're doing an episode on alchemy now. Maybe we should should have led up front with like, what is alchemy? Like, what actually is alchemy for the people who don't play on Arena? Maybe we have one or two listeners who aren't actually like Arena people. They're paper Magic cubers who just kind of want to listen to the podcast. And if you're here for that, hi. So we're going to talk about some pros and cons of alchemy. I wanted to talk mostly about the launch of alchemy and why it's so like disliked by the community and stuff like that. But for those who don't know, and we're droning on about it, like alchemy is an arena only format that allows the designers to tweak existing cards and also create digital only cards that don't exist in paper. And by tweak existing cards, what they'll do is they'll take a card that was overpowered in standard and they will make a second version of it, same exact art, usually like same exact power, toughness, or whatever, and they'll tweak one part of it. They'll make it cost one more, or they'll remove a line of text from it, like the cantrip part of Omnath or something like that. Or they'll buff its power and toughness if it was a card that underperformed that they wanted to do well. So I think that is the part that like is a no-go for me, is the rebalancing, because it just creates a second version of a card that people already know. But then the second part of alchemy is also that they create cards on Arena that don't exist in paper. And I think that's kind of the positive part of alchemy, is you have this digital space, you know, why not use it? So pros and cons, and Teld, feel free to interrupt me at any point here, but pros of like being able to do this in alchemy is that sometimes they make some really forgettable cards playable again. They kind of like reworked a lot of the black-white venture into the dungeon stuff from AFR, and it ended up being like an actual constructed deck that saw play at like a championship, like Mythic Championship or something like that. They buffed some of the blue-black decayed zombie stuff from Midnight Hunt. Like, for instance, they shaved a mana off of some of the like zombies that create decayed zombies, and suddenly they become very playable cards. And obviously the benefit here is you get some intriguing designs and mechanics that you just wouldn't see in paper. And again, I like them using their digital space to do something that you can't do in paper. Like, you have this digital space, why not use it for something? So you do get unique cards like Dragonfly Pilot, which is not a card that you would get in a paper set. So the cons list is maybe a little bit bigger than the pros list. And I think the big thing worth talking about is that Alchemy just had a terrible launch. Like, the way they launched it, they just dumped like 100 digital only cards onto the client. And the unfortunate part was, for whatever reason, they decided that it should affect other formats besides Alchemy. Historic, for example, which is another arena only format, as well as Brawl, which is basically Arena's version of 1v1 Commander. These were affected by Alchemy, so you cannot play those formats without engaging with Alchemy cards and rebalances and stuff like that, which is just not what people wanted. And as far as I know, still not what people want. But if you play those formats and you like them, you have to engage with Alchemy cards, which a lot of people want to opt out of it, and you don't have an option if you're like a Brawl player. You will play against Alchemy cards. And since Alchemy cards tend to be super, super powerful compared to normal, let's say, quote-unquote, normal Magic cards, like, if you play Brawl, you're just going to run into super hyper powerful cards because it's just full of like alchemy stuff.
Yeah, I do think this is more noticeable when you're playing at Peasant, because some of the Peasant like uncommon alchemy cards would just be rares if they were in an actual set. Whereas there are some definitely overtuned alchemy cards, but I don't think that they're just normally the flat out best cards you can be playing. Though sometimes they are.
Yeah, it is very true of uncommons. For whatever reason, the uncommon alchemy cards tend to even be better than the rare alchemy cards themselves, like relative to, you know, other cards of the same rarity. For whatever reason, because they just designed a bunch of like infinite value engines and then slapped an uncommon symbol on them for some reason. I don't know what they're doing. But yeah, Alchemy had a terrible launch. It was something that a lot of people wanted to opt out of, but they couldn't in certain formats. And it was kind of like, what was the point of this? Like, what were we doing? You know,
it had specifically a big impact on Historic for a while because they took a Strixhaven card that was kind of a Delver of Secrets type card that was it's like a 0/2 that when you cast a spell becomes a 2/2.
Yeah, Symmetry Sage.
Yeah, they changed it to a 0/3 that becomes a 3/3, and it was just part of arguably the best deck in Historic for a while. I don't play that format, but my understanding is that's no longer the case. But it did have a pretty big knockdown effect for quite a while in that format.
Yeah, and some of it was just confusing, right? Like, if I remember correctly, Essica's Chariot got rebalanced, and it was like, instead of being a 4-mana vehicle that made 2 2/2s and crew 4, it was like they changed it to a 4-mana vehicle that made 1 2/2 and had crew 2 and still had the like copying ability. So it gave you less stuff up front, but it was like, I know what the card Essica's Chariot does. If I go play paper, this is the Essica's Chariot that I have. But now I have to also know this other altered version of the same card with the same art. Like that just gets really sloppy at some point. And,
I think that was a slick change to the card in a vacuum. Like if you just asked me, like if you show when I look at that card, I'm like, oh, that's a cool change because it doesn't make the card like, I mean, it does make it probably worse, but it's not strictly worse, right? They're trying to accommodate the fact that they nerfed it by giving it a little bit of a compensatory buff instead of just a strict downgrade. But yeah, that's the biggest problem, I think, with the Alchemy rebalances, in particular of non-Alchemy cards. Because I think it's a little easier when you're dealing with an Alchemy card for whatever reason to accept that they just changed the card.
Yeah.
But like when Omnath suddenly costs 5 mana and doesn't draw a card, or, you know, Essica's Chariot now only makes a 2/2. It's hard to have both of those spaces in your brain remember those effects.
Yeah, I mean, because it just creates a second version of the same exact card that you're familiar with, right? And imagine being like an arena player who has only ever played the Alchemy version of Omnath, right? 4-color Omnath, and then you open a paper version of it for the first time or whatever, which like this is not how the progression of Magic players really works, but you're like, oh, this is a different card than the Omnath that I'm used to playing, but it's the same art, so it's very confusing.
Sometimes they seem to forget to go back and change these. Like Luminarch Aspirant and Essica's Chariot were both nerfed, but once they rotated out of Standard, they unnerfed them so that they could put them in arena cubes and stuff. But Guildsworn Prowler was a card that's a 2/1 for 2, 1 in a black, with Death Touch, and if it dies while not blocking, I believe is the text, it draws a card. A very, very good aggressive card out of AFR. And it was a card that if you play with rebalances, for whatever reason, they had this phase where they tried to rebalance draft formats with the Alchemy sets. And so they nerfed this card down to a 1/1, but then after their experiment with this ended, they never went back and buffed it back to a 2/1. So if you play with rebalanced cards to try to get some of the other Alchemy effects and you want to play with this card, it's still a 1/1, which is unplayable. And so it's a weird system of like, we don't undo the nerfs once the reason we nerfed it is no longer relevant.
Yeah, they only unnerf cards, I think, that rotate specifically from Standard. And the Alchemy constructive format also has a different rotation than Standard. It rotates every 2 years still instead of 3. So it's all very sloppy. Like, the launch of this was very sloppy. It was very clear that, like, they were just like, here's a bunch of cards, right? Like, do you remember that first batch? It had a card that cared about the party mechanic. And remember, the name of the first batch was Alchemy Midnight Hunt. And there was this random card that cared about the party mechanic. There was a card that like just removed night and day from the game, which I kind of wish was an effect every card had, is night and day no longer exists in Magic the Gathering. There's a card, I think it's called Lupine Harbingers. It's a 4-mana 4/4 with haste and trample in green. And
is
then
that the Foretell card?
Yeah, but then immediately in Crimson Vow, they printed Ulvenwad Oddity, which is a 4-mana 4/4 with trample and haste in green. And it was like, okay, like, are the people who are making these cards even communicating with the people who are making the paper sets? And Mop brought up a good point this morning that, like, there apparently is a different design team on Arena digital-only cards than people who are making paper Magic, and they might not actually be communicating with the people who make the paper cards, because sometimes you'll see an Alchemy design, and it's like, okay, it's doing this cool thing, but then the next set that comes out in paper will have something that's very suspiciously close to the same exact card, and it's like, like, was that on purpose? Was this on accident? I don't know what's going on. So
the year is 2050. Every mainline Magic set and Alchemy drop have all evolved into crabs.
So yeah, this gets sloppy, but again, here's where Cube comes in. You get to just pick the good stuff out. You get to cherry pick all the good stuff. You can ignore all of the nonsense about constructed. You can ignore rebalances, or well, rebalances of paper cards.
Sort of.
You can't ignore digital rebalances. But I went ahead and compiled like a list of a couple like bullet points of like good uses of the Alchemy design space versus bad uses. And I have a lot of card examples here, but I'm not going to read them all. But let's go down this list real quick. So what makes for some good Alchemy designs? You mentioned this already, but there's a handful of cards that they keep designing that they're almost always removal spells or lands, and they get a slight buff if you were the player who played second. If you weren't the starting player, these cards get a little bit better. So just to read one of them, Radiant Smite is 1 and a white for an instant. It's an uncommon. Destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. If you weren't the starting player, you gain 4 life. It has cycling for white, and if you cycle it and you weren't the starting player, you gain 2 life. So this is just like your standard kind of like, repel the monstrous or whatever, smite the monstrous type card. Like, they print these a lot, but you get to recoup a bunch of life if you weren't the starting player. And I think that's just really, really cool design space is, everybody knows the person who goes first in Magic across every format is advantaged. And being able to give the person who played second a slight buff to their cards for losing the die roll, I think is really neat. There's also like Forsaken Crossroads, which is a tapped scry land that lets you pick which color of mana it taps for. But if you were the player who played second, it comes in untapped. So you get you get kind of like a buffed up land if you played second, which is still a perfectly fine playable card if you played first. These are the type of cards that I think could come to paper, but would require, like, you can go like a 10-person game in paper and then completely, like, both players just don't know who started the game, So like there's a tracking issue here. But I would hope that if they ever did something like this in paper, that like the people playing these cards would just know at the beginning of the game, like, oh, I played first, like, just in case this comes up for whatever cards are in my deck. But I could see that being an issue. Like, we forget about this sort of stuff, even playing with these cards digitally. So I could see why they don't want to bring this sort of mechanic. But I think this is a nice leveling mechanic that could come to paper and could solve a lot of issues for constructed, limited, so on and so forth. It's just like, make my interaction or my first creature of the game like a slight bit better if I was on the draw, because my opponent is advantaged if they won the die roll.
Yeah, I love these effects. I think they are generally also haven't been too egregious. There's none that are just like, okay, well, if you went second, you now win the game or anything like that. They're just like, okay, gain a little extra life, or, your land comes to play untapped or whatever, to just give you a little bit of room to catch up.
Yeah, it's not like Wrath of God, where it's like, if you played second, destroy all creatures your opponent controls, and all of yours gain indestructible. Like, that would just be stupid, which I wouldn't put them past that to actually print something like that in Alchemy. But for the most part, they're just removal spells that get a slight bit better. Oh, most of them just gain you life, or they're 1 less to cast or whatever. So I would like to see some of that in paper. There's also, we mentioned with Dragonfly Pilot in the single card discussion, there's a lot of cards that just conjure really bad cards into the game. But because you're conjuring them into the game, you don't actually have to use like a deck slot or a cube slot on those cards, and you kind of get them incidentally. So a good example of this is You Line Up the Shot. This is a green instant at common that says choose one. Conjure a card named Plummet into your hand, which is an instant that kills a flyer. Conjure a card named Naturalize into your hand, which is an instant that kills an artifact or enchantment. Or you can just draw a card as the third option. And this is just like a cool modal card. Like, I would never play a cube that has Plummet in it. I just wouldn't. Like, if I saw your cube list and I saw that Plummet was in your cube, I would just never play that cube. But You Line Up the Shot lets you play with Plummet, which is sometimes situationally a very good card. Same with Naturalize, depending on what's going on with your opponent. It just gives you a cube slot to use that will occasionally give you Plummet or occasionally give you Naturalize, but also just cantrips, like if you don't need those cards. So I think this is a really sleek design.
Notably, this is where alchemy cards do something that paper cards can sometimes struggle with, which is this adds layers of synergy. I don't expect this to come up in green a ton, but any of the second spell archetypes or like anything like that cares about it, you can do this where you cast the line up the shot and then you cast another spell and trigger your double spell turns. You could cast this at the end of a turn. So instead of like a 3-mana spell that had all 3 of these modes on it, you can fire this off at the end of a turn and then untap your mana and have a 2-mana play from your plummet or your naturalize, which gives you some flexibility in terms of mana as well. So I think this is a really cool design. These are great designs because they give you a lot of extra play that you couldn't really text into a normal Magic card.
Yeah, and I think the thing I like about them most is like I like finding homes for cards that just don't have homes, like plummet, naturalize. Those are basically lost fragments of Magic the Gathering that will like never be relevant ever again. They're just kind of paper that exists in boxes somewhere that people forget about and has no use to anyone. And cards like this, like there's a 4-mana 2/3 that attacks and conjures a Stormfront Pegasus into your hand. Like it gives you that slight feeling of like, oh, Stormfront Pegasus. Like I get to play with that card maybe or whatever, you know?
Yeah. Now, notably, one of the cards you have mentioned here is a card called Landlord Navigator that is 1 in a blue for a 2/1. And when it attacks, it makes a map token. And at the beginning of your end step, if 2 or more artifacts enter the battlefield this turn under your control, conjure a thieving magpie onto the battlefield, not into your hand. This card notably had to get nerfed, if I'm not mistaken. I'm almost positive when this card originally came out, it ETB'd to make a map. And you could do some really, really silly things like turn 3, you'd play this and a tap land. You combined it. There was like a blue-green deck in Artisan for a while where you would play like, was it Tough Cookie? And Tough Cookie would automatically trigger off of this. You could do like this plus the Siren guy that makes a map token. And you could just do some very, very silly turns combined with a few protection effects. And it was a super obnoxious deck to deal with. Now that it has to attack to make the map token, you have to go a lot harder into the synergies in order to make it work. And your explosiveness goes down because you can't trigger it as often the turn it enters play. Now as a card, it's like, I don't know how good it is. It would probably be really obnoxious when it goes off, but is the kind of card that is a little more build aroundy as opposed to being able to pop off on turn 3 or 4 really consistently.
Yeah. And the thing I like there is Thieving Magpie is an awful card. It's a terrible card.
Well, you start getting them for free, though. They're pretty good.
Yeah, they're a lot better when you don't have to use the slot on them. And then the last thing I think Alchemy does really well is it creates some unique cards that you would never see in paper. I think the one Alchemy card that the entire world unanimously agrees is like really cool is Oracle of the Alpha, which is probably the one that most people know because it's actually been printed in paper now. And it's a mainstay of like Arena Cube and stuff like that. Oracle of the Alpha is a 3-mana 2/3 flyer that shuffles a copy of one of each copy of the Power 9 into your library. So like you shuffle every Mox into your library, Time Walk, Ancestral, Black Lotus, whatever that 9th one is, Time Twister, which everybody hits off the top.
I think Oracle of the Alpha, I mean, first of all, the art actually looks really cool. I'm going to give this is actually one of the rare Alchemy arts that I think is just actually very good. But I think there's something to that list of Conjure the Power 9. Like if it said Conjure blah, 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 and you had to list off the Power 9, that would be really obnoxious to read. But like there's something entrenched in like if you've played Magic, obviously if you've played Magic for any real amount of time, you know what the Power 9 is. But it's one of those things that it just somebody off the street would be super confused about. I think there's something to like Power 9 being it being capitalized and just the way I don't know. This card just hits. It just hits. I don't actually think it's that good of a card if I'm being totally honest.
No, I don't.
Because by the time you cast it, the Moxes are not really better than lands. I mean, they're just lands that sometimes trigger spell effects, but occasionally you'll.
This card is good when it's played against you. It's never good when you play it because they always spike Time Walk immediately.
I was gonna say your opponent immediately just draws Ancestral Recall into Time Walk every single time.
Yeah, you would think like. The question I had about this is like if they created an Oracle of the Alpha that said it was like the same exact stat line and it said shuffle a copy of the Power 9 into your opponent's library, would you play it? And like mathematically, like I know like maybe, but at the same time you're just giving like they're just gonna spike Time Walk every single time. So like no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, like but when you look at mathematically, 6 of the cards you're shuffling in are very likely to be not super good. Maybe like maybe Lotus is still good enough when you draw it, but like it's shuffling a bunch of extra lands into your deck functionally. But it's a very cool card. Everybody agrees that this one is a banger in terms of design.
Again, blurring the lines between paper and digital is in Mystery Booster 2, which came out last year. They printed 7 alchemy cards as paper cards, and they're like acorn stamped or whatever, which means that they're not legal for tournament play. They're almost like kind of jokes that they were in the set in the first place. But like somebody at Wizards is like, "Ooh, what if we snuck some of these arena cards into paper for people?" And people will put Org of the Alpha and Cubes, right? Which again, if you're Mr. like no alchemy whatsoever, alchemy equals bad, you miss out on cards like this. I think this is a cool addition to cubes, whether it's good or not. People enjoy playing with it. So poor uses of alchemy design space, and some of these are debatable. I think alchemy should be doing things that paper magic can't. So when they print alchemy cards that are just functional paper magic cards, I get a little peeved about it. And this is actually something they did in Ether Drift alchemy a lot. Is there's like 10 designs in that set that could just work as paper cards with no tweaks whatsoever. So a good example of this is Wish Good Luck, which is red-green for an uncommon sorcery, and it says create a food token, create a treasure token, create a 3/2 colorless vehicle with crew 1, which you could make that card in paper. I know they don't like to do the 3 different tokens and 1 card type thing because of the tracking and paper, but they printed a Killer Among Us, so like don't give me that excuse anymore. Like I can't use that excuse anymore.
Can you imagine this card in your like Packdoll Terror Haunt the Network deck? Just like four color artifact nonsense.
Yeah, just to be clear, the card is absurdly strong, and maybe that's why they didn't print it in paper, because like they're like, we don't want this card in the limited format to be too good. But then I'm like, they've got to find a way to get this in paper eventually, right? I think another example, Bailout from the same set, is a single black mana for that kind of like scam effect, right? You target a creature, and if it dies, it comes back into play, but it also deals a damage to your opponent. The cool thing is it has Overload for 2 black, so if you cast it for its Overload cost, all of your creatures come back into play if they die that turn, and they all deal 1 damage to your opponent. This would be a really sweet commander card if it was printed in paper. Yeah. And there's nothing digital only about it. You don't have to make any tweaks. It could just exist as is in paper, but it's currently tied to Arena and can't be played anywhere else, right?
I am just going to give a small shout out here. And this is the kind of card that I kind of hope we see in paper at some point. Just, if they start printing alchemy cards that could be printed in paper into paper. But I think the reason this one is not in the set is because Overload, right? It kind of has that Modern Horizons kind of vibe, where they start taking mechanics that that were for like previous environments and sticking them on a card. With Alchemy, they don't have the restraint of the set mechanics that were built into the set.
Sure. I think that, there's definitely truth to that, which applies to Overload here, though they do cameo mechanics now. Like they allow some number of cameo mechanics. Like if you look at Ether Drift proper, like there's a single card in the set with Exert. There's a single card in the set that embalms creatures. So like I don't think it would be too crazy to have. Obviously they don't want to make it like a time spiral situation where there's 50 mechanics in every standard set. So I get it, but this card now exists digitally. And I'm like, I want to play that in this commander deck. When do I get it in paper?
Yeah, they may not want to do that, but I'm not gonna lie. Like, I would love if we occasionally got time spirally sets where it was just like 30 different mechanics in one go.
Yeah, I think maybe as a once a year thing, they could do something like that. The thing is, there's an increase in number of these too, like these cards. Usually what'll happen is they'll release a batch of alchemy cards. They always come out in 30, and people will look at them and they'll be like, oh, this card could have existed in paper if they had just changed the word seek to search instead. And it's like, yeah, they that's how they make the digital cards, is they take a paper design and essentially add something digital to it. But these cards don't need that tweak. Like they could just be printed on paper with no tweaks whatsoever. So that annoys me a little bit, but at least these cards exist.
The thing I find the weirdest, and why I'm surprised that it wasn't, they would have been upshifted to rare to put in the set, but Wish Good Luck is also, the art on it is a very story driven. Yeah. It's a moment that actually is supposed to be relevant in the story, and it sort of feels like this just got cut from the set. And yeah, I kind of feel like they could have upshifted this to rare and stuck it in the set, and I wouldn't have blinked.
Yeah, it's Nissa giving Chandra like some sort of pendant. In fact, the pendant she's given to Chandra is the same pendant they used in the art for the treasure token in the main set. So like
Yeah, and then Chandra gets her bike and Nissa packs her a lunch. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, it is very weird that some of these cards didn't make it in.
Yeah. Now, Deviant Skytech, the other one we talked about, is one that like it's just Lingering Souls, and that's why it's not in the set.
Yeah, we should actually just I don't want to go too in depth on every single card I posted here, but just to mention Deviant Skytech real quick. This is a 2 and a blue for an uncommon enchantment. It has start your engines, and when it enters, it makes 2/1/1 colorless Thopters with flying. And then once you have max speed, you can pay 1 in a blue, sack the enchantment, and make 2 more colorless Thopters with flying. We actually had this kind of lined up to add to our Peasant Cube. But the day I wanted to add it, or the day I made changes, these alchemy cards weren't on Cube Cobra yet. So I was like, okay, put it on the back burner. I'll come back to it. And then I played the alchemy. They had a midweek magic event on Arena where it was basically just pre-con decks that were full of like the new alchemy cards. And I played against Deviant Skytech like 3 times. And I was like, okay, this is a bad idea to add, which Teld said. He was like, I don't think this is a smart idea to add this card to the Peasant Cube. And I was like, I want to try it. And then I played against it 3 times. And I was like, okay, the universe is telling me between this not being on Cube Cobra and having like just this card absolutely rock me in this midweek magic, like this is a bad idea to put in your cube. Don't put it in your cube. So it is not in our Peasant Cube, even though again there's nothing digital only about it. It is just paper magic rules. So
yeah, I just found out about this because I was about to when Tim said that we were adding it to the cube, I was about to give my my declaration that this is Tim strong arming me.
Okay, so just to breeze through the rest of like poor uses of design space, they just make cards with tons of text on them, which it's kind of funny. There have been a couple alchemy cards where if you're playing on Arena, you actually have to scroll down the rules text to get to like the rest of the rules text, which is just embarrassing.
I think we can actually just combine the next 2 because all 6 of these cards are just, if we don't talk about all of them, but they're all in the same category of blatantly overpowered and too much text.
Yeah, blatantly overpowered cards. Yeah, there's this thing where I think they intentionally make the alchemy cards super, super powerful to try to entice people to play it, because like alchemy has a bunch of standard, like the alchemy constructed format has a bunch of standard cards in it. So like, why would I play this alchemy format if the cards that are exclusive to it aren't at least better than the standard cards, because I could just be playing standard. So they just juice the power level of these cards. And I don't really want to read like any of them, honestly. Just know that like 80% of alchemy cards are like way more powerful than they should be.
Yeah, I want to read off. I want to read off one of them and then reference another. So the one I'm going to reference real quick is just if you play Brawl at all and you've tried to quote unquote power max, which is a bad idea. Play bad commanders. It'll make your games more fun. But there's a card called Rusko Clockmaker that is 2 blue black 3/3, and it conjures a midnight clock and then drains your opponent for every time you cast a non-creature spell. And it's just like got its own special place at the top of Hell Queue. Even cards like Ragavan are lower in the position of Hell Queue than Rusko. I'm pretty sure it's like at the tippy top of you only play against Rusko players.
Yeah, it's just stupidly good.
And then one that I think is low-key busted that, you know, if you've played the some of the cubes that this has been in, you know it's broken, but maybe when you read it, it doesn't read as broken. And that's Lae'zel Gith Yankee Warrior. So it's 3 and a white for a 2/4 with double strike, and it specializes for 1, which is where you've actually got 6 cards in 1. I'm not going to explain what all the different sides do. But when you cast it, it gains this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls. You may exile it and return it to the battlefield under its owner control. And all of its forms that it gets when it specializes have a when it specializes or ETB effect. If I remember right.
Yeah.
And so you just you'll trigger it when you specialize, and then your opponent, if they target it, it'll blink itself and it'll get the specialized trigger again. And it does things ranging from like making dues, drawing cards, whatever. And this card is just very, very silly because it frequently just bricks your opponent's board and they have to shoot 2 removal spells at it if you don't have a Wrath. It's just a very, very silly card.
Very stupid. Specialized was definitely... Specialized hurt Alchemy's reputation more than it was already hurt when it came out.
Yeah.
We're not going to go into detail on how Specialized works. I think there are some cool Specialized things. I think there's room for, you know, using Specialized in the future. But holy crap, Specialized was the most complex. It basically makes 6-sided cards where your 1 card can turn into any of 5 different cards. It's kind of like a transform thing, but like you have to know what 5 different versions of your card do. It's just off the deep end.
Yeah, and I think 90% of the time this wasn't bad because most of the specialized cards did the exact same thing, just mildly flavored differently. So it would like gain life, you'd lose life, it'd gain haste, whatever. Just it would add a color specific mechanic to it.
Yeah.
But there were a few of them that had either entirely different effects for each specialized. There was a couple of them that did that, and then one or two of them that one of the specialized versions was randomly way more broken than everything else you could be doing with it. And so that was where it created a nightmare. I think the like if specialized is just a bunch of different mildly flavored different effects, it's not that bad. But when you had to actually memorize a bunch of different card effects, yeah, it got real silly.
Yeah. We already mentioned making alternate versions of existing cards. I think this is just egregious when they use the same art as a paper card and just change it to a different effect altogether. And then the last thing I really don't like that they do sometimes, really only in like the original batches, were these color break-in cards like Tome of the Infinite, which was a blue artifact that could conjure random cards from a spell book into your hand, but some of the cards were like Fog and Swords to Plowshares and Lightning Bolt, and it's like I could play a mono blue deck that just randomly gets Lightning Bolts and Swords to Plowshares. It just doesn't feel right. So I've never been a fan of those as well. But
yeah, it's also the kind of card that is it's not like blatantly overpowered, but if you were ever playing in a slower environment where like you weren't under a huge amount of pressure, this card's like kind of unbeatable card advantage.
Yeah, it's like the only card that ends up mattering in a longer prolonged game, and it's an inevitable win con because it'll just draw you random lightning bolts sometimes too. So I hate stuff like that personally. I don't think a mono blue deck should ever have access to like a bunch of lightning bolts. It just doesn't make sense to me. But
when Alchemy first launched, Key to the Archive was also super busted. Yeah. So it 4 mana ETBs tapped, and then it conjured you got to draft, which is where you conjure a card, but you get to select from like 3 different ones. And it selected from a handful of very powerful interactive pieces or win conditions in some cases. Like
Approach of the Second Sun was in there. Time Warp was in there.
And it's a double mana rock, but so you could hit like Time Warp, you could hit Wrath of God, you could hit all of these random cards, and it caused the extra mana it provided plus the sheer amount of versatility it provided was really, really broken in a lot of different control decks for a while.
Yeah, you could be a mono black deck that plays this and suddenly have access to like a Time Warp or a Sword Supply, like just things that your color's not supposed to have. So not a fan of those personally, but they don't make too many of those anymore either. I think they've recognized that. So let's transition into like Cube. Like, why does this stuff matter for Cube, especially for digital Cube? And the big point here, again, to reiterate, is that you get to cherry pick the good Alchemy designs. I just said like a minute ago that like 80% of Alchemy cards are just overpowered by design. Well, you don't have to play with those. Just play with the ones you like. Play with the ones that are a good fit for your environment. And if you are power maxing, if you're an arena player who just wants to make the most powerful Cube you can, Alchemy is going to make up a good portion of that if you're open to it. Like, there are really powerful designs that feel like you're playing vintage Magic sometimes, or vintage Cube or whatever. Mop's Timeless Cube in our environment, which is a pretty popular cube, has a lot of Alchemy designs that hold their own next to, all the sneak attack, channel, show and tell shenanigans, reanimate shenanigans that are going on in that format. So you as a cube designer get to kind of parse through and see what you like and just ignore the rest of it,
Particularly in regards to, I stress, I'm hesitant to call it fair, but in regards to like fair decks where your game plan is to win by combat damage and interacting with your opponent's board and generating card advantage, Alchemy designs are some of the ways that the fair deck can keep up with some of the unfair game plans, right? A card like, and we haven't really talked about it, but Sigardian Evangel is 2 and a white, 1 and a white. For a 3/1 that ETBs to tap a card and then conjure another copy into your hand. And so you can use it to add a bunch of board presence and tap down your opponent's cards in order to push through damage. And it's one of the ways that like a white aggressive strategy playing fair cards can keep up when your opponent tries to, just scam you or play some sort of sneak attack style thing if you're still alive. I'm a little hesitant, like I said, to call it fair designs, but a lot of these Alchemy cards are powerful card advantage engines that can help you keep up and generate a lot of card advantage when your opponent's doing some really, really silly things.
Yeah. By the way, Sigardian Evangel was one of the 7 digital cards that was printed in the mystery booster too. Funnily enough, they put an uncommon symbol on all of them too, so I guess technically they're peasant legal. Can you imagine Sigardian Evangel and Peasant Cube? Just the stupidest thing in the world. But We've talked a little bit about advantages and disadvantages to Alchemy. In Cube, in particular, like, obviously the advantage is that you just get to add cards to your card pool that could fill in some gaps, and, like, there are some really cool things going on with Alchemy. Like, I think Dragonfly Pilot, which we discussed, is, like, additive to our environment, and if it were replaced by some other random white one-drop in our cube, we'd actually be missing out on something. There's a couple other examples of that. We'll talk about some cards that we really like later on as well. It is worth noting there are downsides to adding Alchemy cards to your cube. I think the main one is that, like, there are some players out there who just do not acknowledge Alchemy as, like, real in any way, and there's a huge stigma behind it. So, like, we have seen Alchemy can be a deterrent for some players. Like, we've had literal players be like, I'm not going to play this cube because there's Alchemy cards in it. I think as long as you're responsible with the Alchemy cards you're adding, and you're, like, cognizant of the fact that, like, they can be super powerful, and you kind of balance for that they're not as harmful, and, like, if people just want to dismiss them because they have the word alchemy or whatever on them, like, that's totally their prerogative. But we have seen this negatively affect people's opinions of cubes before.
And to be fair, I expect to see more of this with Universes Beyond being the way it is. I could see people being like, okay, you have UUB cards or whatever, or UB cards in your cube. I don't really want to play that or craft those or whatever. I sort of expect moving forward that will probably fade. I actually think Universes Beyond will probably make Alchemy seem more acceptable, because it's just kind of, what's the word? Like, it's kind of blurring the line between what defines a magic, what makes a magic card. So I do get it in a sense that if you don't like playing with digital designs, but there are some of them that are very, very additive, and we enjoy them. But yeah, the player stigma is definitely a thing, and we've had our own little rant video about Alchemy, and we trash it on our own time, frequently enough. But I think overall, it's just you have to be very judicious and responsible about which ones you're including and making sure they're a good fit to your environment.
Yeah, don't like, if you're trying to make a balanced peasant cube, don't make like 10% of your cube Alchemy, because those cards are just better than everything else. But another big downside here, which doesn't come up very often, especially if you're just not playing a lot of Alchemy cards to begin with, is that the actual digital only creations, not the rebalances, but the actual, like, this card only exists on Arena, the designers can change what that card looks like at any time. And they do this sometimes. They'll have these batches where they, like, buff or nerf a card based on, like, how it's performing, I guess, in the Alchemy constructed format, to the point where, like, a card that you've been playing for a while might suddenly become either unplayable or too good just overnight. And we saw this in our mainline cube with a Talion's Throne Guard, which was a 4-mana 2/2 flash flyer that bounced a spell off the stack or a permanent, or was it a 2/1? Yeah. So kind of like a flying Venser. It had this, like, weird bargain text that made it an Alchemy card that, like, basically didn't matter. But it was basically a flying Venser, and we thought it was a really cool fit for our cube. For our mainline cube, it did something that basically no other card was doing at the time. But then a couple months ago, they made it a 4/2 instead of a 2/1 and changed nothing else about the card. So they just added +2/+1 stats on this card, and suddenly it became this, like, super oppressive beater that was also tempoing your opponent out. And it was like, okay, we got to let go of this card.
Turns out when you take a fine card and slap a trusty machete on it perpetually, it becomes much better. We talked about this one when the change happened, and we left it in our cube for a little while, and it was quite good. I don't think it was quite as busted as we expected, but I think that was more just the games we saw rather than the actual card's power level. It was very, very powerful when we saw it do its thing. But I was really surprised they buffed it to a 4/2 instead of, like, messing with it as a 3/1 or like a 2/2 or a 3/2 first.
They just went. They were like, we want this card to be played, and we want it played now.
Yeah, I think if they'd left it as a 3/1, made it into a 3/1, we probably would have left it in our cube. At least left it longer. It would have taken longer for it to be so obviously powerful.
Mm-hmm. Again, though, like, not a huge issue. Like, if they do that, you can just remove the card from your cube if it becomes too good.
Good news, too, it was also a 4-drop, and they've given us a lot of really great 4-drops over the last year, and it's a spot that we don't have a lot of room in our cube for, so we get new cards to test out, and it wasn't a big deal. We were just like, okay, whatever. We'll just put in Enduring Curiosity or whatever.
Yeah, most Magic players don't mind when you remove Alchemy cards from your cube, so, like, it was just one less Alchemy card we were playing. I will note for Peasant Cubers, a big downside here is if you just, like, kind of, if you give your cube, like, unfettered access to the best possible, like, Alchemy uncommons on the client, they're just going to be the best cards in your cube. Like we mentioned, the uncommons, for whatever reason, are just, like, insane compared to normal uncommons in Magic sets, which is saying a lot because the power level of uncommons these days is crazy. But like, I don't want to list off every single card, but like, for whatever reason, the uncommons just tend to be like these infinite value engines that every turn like create a new card, or they're just like insanely statted for their cost or whatever. They do things that normally rares do. So it's kind of crazy. There's also
you'll be looking at the alchemy cards, especially because on the arena client we don't have access to the traditionally broken, but these are technically peasant cards. So that power level is a little more obvious. I mean, some of the very, very top end stuff like Immodange Recruiter will still kind of shine, but outside of those absolute top tier kind of peasant cards, the alchemy cards really steal the show.
Yeah. So just note that like if you just slap 30 alchemy cards into your cube, especially at the peasant level, like they're going to be the best cards in your cube, which you can determine whether that's what you want or not. I will also say some of the cards that have spell books, like spell book is this thing where like a card will reference its spell book and there'll be like 15 cards in its spell book. And when you activate a certain ability or a trigger happens, it'll say draft a card from this card's spell book, and it'll pull up 3 random cards. You'll pick one of them from a wider pool of 15 cards, and you'll add it to the game in some way, shape, or form. It is worth noting some of the uncommon cards with spellbooks actually have rares and mythic rares in the spellbook, which I think is like very much against the spirit of Peasant Cube to just like randomly create a mythic rare card that like wasn't supposed to be in your cube. So I would avoid just playing these all together. A really egregious example of this is Celestial Vault. Yeah, which is a 1 in a white artifact. At uncommon, you can pay white and draft a card from its spellbook and exile it face down. And the spellbook is just a bunch of angels, but there's things like Baneslayer Angel in there and Angel of the Dire Hour. Yeah, it's just like a bunch of uncommon and mythic rare angels. And then when you pay 1 mana and sacrifice the Celestial Vault, you put all those cards into your hand. So like you get to just stockpile a bunch of mythic rare angels underneath this uncommon artifact and then sack it at some point and just add like 5 Baneslayer angels to your hand, which is just incredibly stupid.
Yeah, it simultaneously breaks the spirit of Peasant in regards to the card rarity, but also is the infinite value engines you mentioned, because the decks that you'll play Celestial Vault in, you just basically...
Cursebound Witch, another one that people really like playing with. It's a 1-drop. When it dies, you draft a card from its spellbook. It's an uncommon, but like the spellbook has like cruel... what is it? The curse, the 7-mana curse that like makes your opponent sack a creature every turn or lose 5 life. It's just like stupid. March Toward Perfection's another one that you can it's an uncommon that can give you like a Phyrexian Obliterator, which is just like whatever. So I would say avoid those. Like if you're going to be lenient on alchemy, don't be that lenient. Like you should not be able to create a rare or mythic rare in your peasant cube. I think that's just like super stupid. But play those cards in your like unrarity restricted cubes. They're fine there, but not in peasant cube. Teld, I wanted to take a little chunk of this to not necessarily like go in depth about arena mechanics or digital only mechanics, but I think for the paper cubers out there, there are a few mechanics that can be tweaked or can work in a paper cube. We've heard from members of our community before that they do play certain alchemy cards in paper. They might have to like adjust the way it plays slightly, but I wanted to give a couple examples of like mechanics or cards that can be tweaked to work in paper for people who just want to experiment with this sort of thing. Because again, I think there are some really cool designs. So Seek is one. Basically, seeking in Magic means you grab a card from your library within a certain like constraint or a certain parameter of cards and add it to your hand, but it doesn't actually search your library, so it doesn't actually shuffle. You just kind of like randomly get a card from your deck that meets a certain like criteria. So an example of this would be Kindred Denial, which is 2 blue for an uncommon instant, counter target spell, seek a card with the same mana value as that spell. So it kind of plays out exactly like Dismiss, counter a spell, draw a card, but you get a card with the same mana value as whatever you countered. So if you countered a 3-drop, Arena will say, okay, I'm going to pull a random 3-drop from your deck and put it into your hand. But you don't search, you don't mess up your scries or surveils, you don't shuffle your library. If you wanted a card like this to work in paper, all you have to do is tweak Seek to like a cascade type thing, right? Like instead of some digital client randomly grabbing you a card, you just flip cards from the top of your library until you hit a card that meets the criteria. And this works for most Seek cards.
Yeah, it will mess up your scries and stuff then. But
It will change the functionality a little bit because you'll reveal cards, which Seek doesn't do. You'll have to put cards on the bottom of your library. You don't have to shuffle necessarily unless you're like actually searching your library. But if you want to try out Seek cards in paper, they work fine if you just kind of treat them like Cascade cards. Again, that's changing the functionality, but I think you could. I think Kindred Denial is a good example of a card that people might want to play with. Like, they know how Dismiss works. They know what this card is supposed to do. It's not super complicated. It just happens to have the word Seek on it instead of like some sort of Cascade-esque ability.
Dismiss that never draws you a land is also very nice in that regard.
Does miss sometimes. we've you counter a 7-drop, you don't have any 7-drops in your deck. It's a little awkward, but
Sure.
there are a lot of Seek cards. Seek is one of the more popular things. Conjure. This one gets a little bit weird because you can conjure to a lot of different zones, right? One thing you can't do is like there are cards that'll be like conjure a random card from your opponent's library into your hand. Obviously, you can't do that in paper, or if you do, it's like too convoluted. But some cards like Dragonfly Pilot, they just conjure a random card from outside the game into the game. And you can make these work in paper by just having those cards on hand, right? You could have a little stack of Dragonfly Pilots on the side of your cube, or rather, Dragonfly Suits. When someone plays Dragonfly Pilot, you hand them a sleeved up Dragonfly suit and give it to them, and it's like, okay, here's your Dragonfly suit. That card exists in paper. I already have it. Another example, Kami of Bamboo Groves has some other abilities, but it has a channel ability that says 2 and a green, discard this creature, conjure 2 cards named Forest into your hand. Usually cube designers already have sleeved up basics, so it's not too hard to just grab 2 forests from, the cube curator or whatever and add them to your hand. This card just works in paper. I have seen a lot of cubes actually that play this card in paper, and it's not that hard to parse it out. There is a logistical issue where if you add cards to your deck and they're especially sleeved up with the same like color sleeves and everything, it's easy to like shuffle them up when the game ends and accidentally like start up a new game with conjured cards in your library. So you got to watch out for that.
Sorry, one way to avoid this is if you're the cube designer and you're using the basics, have all of your main basics that are going to go into people's decks be of one art, and then if you have the or like the conjured forest be of a different art, and that's noticeably different, so that way you can separate them.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to mention, again, the blurring of lines here. They kind of do conjure in paper sometimes. Remember Rao in the Implicit Maze from Modern Horizons 3? It doesn't use the word conjure, but it makes a Spellgorger Weird token. Like, that could very easily be a digital-only card that says Conjure Spellgorger Weird. Disa the Restless, also from Modern Horizon 3, makes Tarmogoyf tokens. Garth One-Eyed, which from Modern Horizons 2 just, like, creates a Black Lotus spell on the stack or something like that. Like,
yeah, Roxanne conjures a meteorite.
Yeah. They do this sparingly without using the word conjure. So like, however those cards work, most of the conjure cards on Arena could work the same way. Starting intensity. This is kind of a weird one. A lot of the cards aren't worth it, but I'm going to read this little dude real quick from the Bloomborough Alchemy set. Chittering Skull Speaker. It's 1 and a black for a 1/1 uncommon Squirrel Warlock. It has start in intensity 0. And it says when it enters, cards you own named Chittering Skull Speaker intensify by 1. So it would go up to it would go up to intensity 1 when it enters the battlefield. And then you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is this thing's intensity. So the idea here is like, this is basically Dusk Legion Zealot, 1 mana, 1/1, lose a life, draw a card on ETB, but it makes all Chittering Skull Speakers better when you play the next one. Like, if you reanimate it, it'll go up to intensity 2, or all the other ones in your deck, if you draw them, they'll go up to intensity 2, and they'll get progressively better and better. I don't think intensity would be that hard to track in paper. Like, first off, you could just use a die on the side of the thing. Like, how many intensity cards do you really have in your deck, and just use that die to track intensity? Or if you're like a really, really like astute cube designer, you could have some sort of like token on the sidelines that represents the intensity cards and what their intensity is. Kind of like you would track max speed. There's a little paper max speed thing. I think if you want to play with intensity cards, you could make it work very, very easily.
I will say specifically, this card turns into a very massive draw engine in most peasant cubes, though.
Yeah. First off, like, you don't have to play multiple copies of this card. Like, you could just put like 3 copies of Chitter and Skull Speaker into a cube, and I think it'd be pretty cool.
Oh, I just know Skyfishers and Reanimation.
Yeah. Like, this increases its own intensity forever. So, like, if you just blink it, it comes back in and draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. Like, maybe the card's actually just overpowered, but
just turns into a speed demon pretty quickly.
Yeah, it does become Speed Demon. It's just a 1/1 Speed Demon. So yeah, the card itself might be egregious, but the intensity thing kind of works out just fine. The last one I wanted to mention, actually there's 2 more, but I wanted to get your take on boons. The best way to describe them is they're like one-shot triggered abilities that don't really exist as a permanent on the battlefield. They're just like, they're kind of like lingering there, and they're like, next time something happens, this boon will trigger and you'll get a one-time effect. And Tenacious Pup is like a really common example of this. This is a single green mana for a 1/2 creature. When it enters the battlefield, you gain a life, and then you get a boon, a one-time boon that says whenever you cast a creature spell, it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter, a trample counter, and a vigilance counter. So basically, this is a 1-drop creature that says the next time you play a creature, it doesn't have to be this turn, just the next creature you play this game will come in with some benefits because it'll trigger this boon. I feel like boons could exist in paper. I know, like, tracking things across multiple turns can get difficult, and, like, especially if your next creature is, like, 3 turns away, you might forget the boon. But I think a solution to this would be that they could print boon, like, tokens, quote-unquote tokens, the same way they print creature tokens, and you could just have something to represent your boon the same way you would have, like, a little paper thing to represent your emblem. I know they're not permanent, so, like, you would have to just recognize that, like, this is not a permanent, but, like, I think they could represent these somehow in packs and print a couple boon cards. I think boons are actually pretty neat.
Yeah, conceptually, I like it. I think they could. My problem with it is I sort of feel like at competitive events, what's going to end up happening is someone's going to forget their boon trigger for a couple of turns, cast a couple creatures, and then quote unquote remember it down the road when they play a creature they would really like to boon, and then they'll get the judge called on them, and the judge will spot them a Lotus Petal as a compensation for their problem and let them have their boon.
Yeah, and again, this is where I'm like back and forth on it, because like these tracking things are the reason that some of these cards are digital only. And there's an alchemy card called Electrostatic Blast, I think. It's basically 2 mana, deal 2 at instant speed, like fine card. But then it says the next time you cast an instant or sorcery, or I think it has actually been changed to say you get a boon that says the next time you cast an instant or sorcery, look at the top 3 cards of your library, pick one, you may cast that card until the end of the turn. And I would, like, when that card was revealed and these cards were revealed, I was like, oh, people could track this in paper. But then we played Electrostatic Blast, and I forgot about it every single time. Like, you would cast Electrostatic Blast, your next instant or sorcery you would cast, like, 3 turns later, and you would just forget that Electrostatic Blast would trigger. So, like, it's easy to say, oh, I would remember this, but it would cause issues in paper.
Not to mention with that card, you'd oftentimes forget. Since you'd forget, you'd a lot of times like be like, damn, need to hit my land drop, and then you'd cast on your opponent's turn to remove a creature. Randomly just hit a land off of it. You're like, oh, I should have just done this at sorcery speed. It's a very, very difficult to remember all of that. I think the boons are interesting, but I do think it would be difficult. We see them in paper sometimes where it's like if you do something this turn, you get it, but it's easier to remember something on a single turn rather than across multiple turns.
Yeah, so like Kamano Faces Kakazan, Chapter 2 says like whenever you cast a creature spell this turn, or whenever you cast your next creature spell this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. And it's like, okay, that's basically a boon, but I only have to remember it for the remainder of the turn that the trigger happens. So in order for this to actually work in paper, you would have to have something physical to represent it, I think. And I think they could do that. Like if it was a set that they just put in like 4 cards that created boons, they could create boon tokens, quote unquote. And I think that would actually solve that issue a little bit. And I think there would be some cool design space. But yeah, if they don't do that, there's definitely some issues that could come up with this.
I think another way to do this too would be if they did boon, it would need to be like the boon would be a specific mechanical boon. So instead of having it like Eldraine roll tokens where there's 6 or 7 different boons, maybe it's just you gain a 1 or 2 boons in the set and they're named, right?
Sure.
So maybe like a boon of power gives you like a +1 counter, and like a boon of life gives you 2 life when you cast a creature or something like that.
Yeah, that could be a solution as well. Though I think pretty much every boon that we've seen in Alchemy Designs is something different from every other boon, so they would have to like homogenize something to make it work in paper. Last mechanic here, Heist. Heist might actually be a divisive mechanic because it's like a steal your opponent's cards type mechanic, so people don't. People like casting cards like that and hate having cards like that cast against them. Let's just put it that way. But what Heist does is whenever you heist an opponent, the arena client will show you 3 random non-lands from their library, and you pick one, exile it face down, and you can cast it as long as it remains face down. Notably, it never hits lands, and B, it doesn't show your opponent the cards. But this kind of works in paper, right? If you really want it to, just the only tweak you would have to make is like reveal the top 3 cards instead of 3 random non-lands. And sometimes you would hit lands, which is changing the functionality of Heist a little bit. But honestly, sometimes don't you want to hit lands with your Siphon Insight type card or your Gonti or whatever? So I don't think that's necessarily even downside.
You can also modulate the power of it, right? So if you made it where you can't play lands, right, then sometimes Heist is going to kind of whiff, right? There's not going to be a lot of good value out of it if you can't play the lands off of it. Or maybe you want it to do that so you can enable it like some of the Gontis do. Because there are cards like Ragavan, for example, kind of heist your opponent library, but you can't play lands off of it. Also, I will say in terms of just mechanically as written, Heist ends up being one of those mechanics that plays way stronger than it reads.
Yes.
It reads pretty good, and it plays like one of the best mechanics ever printed.
Yeah, it cantrips your opponent's library with selection, and it doesn't hit lands. So, like, you just usually get... And it happens to be that, like, Heist was attached to very powerful cards, like the Thievin Aven and Grenzo. God, like, Grenzo was just stupidly strong, but... an example of a heist card I could totally see in a peasant cube, like a paper peasant cube, is Grave Expectations. Great name, by the way. Black mana for an uncommon instant. Choose one. Heist target opponent's library, or exile up to 3 cards from an opponent's graveyard and gain 3 life. And if you just wanted to play that in paper, just tell your people, like, okay, there are heist cards in my cube. They look at the top 3 cards of your opponent's library. Kind of like a Thief of Sanity, It wouldn't be that complicated. Obviously, you're tweaking it a little bit because it's not exactly what Heist does. But if you want to play these cards, like, you can just make a minor tweak and play these cards in paper.
Yeah, the other option of that would be to change the modality to be like reveal until you reveal 3 non-lands and then choose one. Your opponent then knows about the card, but you maintain so like which part of the functionality do you want to retain? The secret information or the Heist hits only 3 non-lands?
Yeah. And then there's other I don't want to explain all these mechanics, but Perpetual, Spellbooks, Double Team, Incorporate, like, these are mechanics I wouldn't even pursue in paper because they just get super complicated at that point.
I'm glad Incorporate's a well we haven't gone back to recently.
Yeah, that one was not. That was a MKM thing, and I don't think they've touched it again. They don't really need to. It's kind of silly and nonsensical. But two more kind of like subcategories to kind of close things out here. What would we like to see from Alchemy? Because clearly we're doing this episode, and the Aetherdrift Alchemy stuff inspired us a little bit. Like, it felt like a step in the right direction. Bloomburrow Alchemy actually did the same thing last year, and Duskmorn Alchemy is not bad either. So, like, the last kind of 3 Alchemy batches have been, I think, higher quality than, like, the whole first 2 years of Alchemy batches. And I'm wondering, like, what would we like to see from Alchemy moving forward, or what do we think Alchemy needs to do to kind of get on players' good sides? Because it's clear they're going to keep doing this. They've been doing it for 4 years. I don't know anyone who likes Alchemy, but, like, they keep doing it. So someone out there is playing with these cards and they're making money off of it. So what does it need to do to kind of, like, capture the players to get them to actually be interested in this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I really love, and I mentioned this with Dragonfly Pilot, that the cards that are bad body create an unplayable card to make it totally playable are some of my favorite cards. Like, one of the things that I wish we would have gotten out of this DFT Alchemy that they didn't give us was I have a fascination with the card Burner Rocket. I really love that card's design. I think it's slick and super sweet, but I don't think it's a very good card, right? It ends up being a very mediocre card. But what if we had, I don't know, Afterburner Specialist or something that was like a 2-mana 2/1 that conjured a Burner Rocket in your hand?
Sure.
Obviously that would just be like Dragonfly Pilot 2, but I really like these sort of, like, they put these nifty unplayable cards in the format and then give us a card that lets us actually make those cards playable. Beyond that, just more designs that are not crazy overpowered that only work in digital. there's cards that don't really work in paper or don't work cleanly in paper. A lot of the secret information stuff is clunky in paper, but works really well in the digital client. So stuff like that. I also love when they downshift, functionally downshift some cards. So like we saw in Reflection Net is kind of like a downshifted Assimilation Aegis, which is pretty, maybe Reflection Net came out first actually. I'm not sure.
It was LCI and then Assimilation Aegis came out in OTJ the next year.
Yeah, I like that those two cards are mechanically fairly similar, but have some different edges that make them better in different environments or more focused on different environments. So, I really like what they've been doing with Alchemy lately. Just do less perpetual, do less of the incorporate double team nonsense, and give us more of these like secret information, X spells or spells that do something that is difficult to do, conjuring cards that otherwise are not very good. That sort of thing is the digital space that I really like. And part of that is because these are closer to traditional Magic cards, right? They're not cards that are super far out there. They're not these infinite value engines, generally speaking. They're not these cards that are just breaking the game in half. They're just adding to the texture of available cards on Magic.
Yeah. I would like to see them tweaking some of the cards that are arena only into paper cards. I would like to, I mean, you mentioned Reflection Net. It feels like that was a direct inspiration for Assimilation Aegis. There had to have been communication between the two teams on this. There's no way they designed these two cards like within 6 months of each other without collaborating. Maybe they did. Maybe I'm wrong, but there's one card on Arena called Sky Shroud Ambush. It's a very powerful card, but it's one in a green for an instant. It's a common, and it says target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. When the creature you control wins the fight, draw a card. And that's very intuitive. It's understood what that means, but because of some weird things with like damage from multiple sources and stuff like that, it doesn't actually have rules that support it in paper. But I feel like you could just write rules that support it in paper, right? Like, what does it mean to win a fight? Like, your creature engaged with a fight and is still alive when the fight is done, right? Like, people know what this card means. It works. It works digitally.
And just put at the end of it, just put in parentheses, your creature wins the fight if it is alive at the end of the resolution of this effect or whatever.
Yeah, so there aren't too many examples of cards like this, but that's the type of thing I would like to see. In paper, obviously, I would like to see boons in paper with like the caveat that there needs to be something to physically represent them. I would really like to see the if you weren't the start-in player type cards in paper as well, though I acknowledge that could actually be a bad idea to do.
There is one terminology change I really hope they would do. I'm actually looking at this Loch Laurent card, which is a land that has an activate ability that gives your opponent a one-time boon that debuffs their creature. It enters with a stun counter on it and it enters tapped. And I think that needs to be changed to Bane to represent that we are debuffing our opponent's cards. I think saying it as a boon for your opponent feels really weird when it nerfs their creature. That's not something that like needs to happen necessarily, but I think it would be more clear as to what the card is actually intending to do, which is like harm your opponent.
Yeah, that would be a cool change. Close out. I guess the time to actually gush about some alchemy cards. Like we probably shouldn't spend too long. I could gush forever on these, but I picked out 6 cards for myself that I'm gonna just kind of read through, and I hope these like inspire people a little bit, because I think these are cards that you could add to your digital cubes and they would actually like increase the fun factor. I think they're actually quite good. Some of them are pretty strong. So just to kind of rapid fire these: Vine Soul Spider, 1 in a green for an uncommon 3/2 with reach. And at the beginning of your end step, put a random land card from your library into your graveyard. So nice little deck thinning while also filling up your graveyard. And if you have lands in the graveyard matters type synergies, that's a cool little one. Plus 2 mana 3/2 reach. They gave it solid stats to start with. Paths of Tuinvale from Wilds of Eldraine. This is 1 in a blue for an instant. Choose one or both. Return target creature you control to its owner's hand. It perpetually costs 1 generic mana less to cast, and then return target creature you don't control to its owner's hand. It perpetually costs 1 generic mana more to cast. So think Runaway Together, but supercharged. It makes the thing you bounce back cheaper, and it makes the thing your opponent bounces back more expensive, and is kind of absolutely insane with Archaeomancer type cards like Shipwreck Dowser. and things like that.
Yeah, it becomes a straight combo with Shipwreck Dowser after a couple of triggers because you're just able to like start bouncing your opponent's board and replay, and it's very, very silly.
You'll get your Shipwreck Dowser to just blue to cast, and then your opponent's cards will all cost like 7 mana to redeploy. Again, this one's a supercharged one, super powerful. Same with Steady Tortoise. I think this design is just super fun. This is also from Wilds of Eldraine. It's kind of like Tortoise in the Hair, which I don't think they really did in the actual Eldraine set. So Steady Tortoise is 4 and a green for a 3/3 uncommon with Ward 2, and it says whenever you attack, Steady Tortoise perpetually gets +1/+1, so just +1/+1 forever, no matter what zone it goes to. And it pivotally says this ability also triggers if Steady Tortoise is in exile, which matters because it has an adventure called Harry Dash for a single red mana. Create a 1/1 rabbit with haste. So obviously, play this on turn 1, right? Get a 1/1 with haste. Steady Tortoise goes to exile because it's an adventure. Attack with the 1/1, Steady Tortoise gets +1/+1, and then every time you attack for the rest of the game, the Steady Tortoise just gradually gets bigger and bigger and bigger. By the time you actually cast it, it's like a 6/6 with Ward 2 that continues to get bigger every time you attack. So it's kind of a messed up card, but it's a very cool card as like a slow, big green creature that also spots you a 1/1 haste on turn 1. I think this is like peak Gruul gaming. Even if the card is like probably better than most of the other actual paper Gruul cards you could play.
Crazy powerful, but it is a cool design. It's just one that like you read it, you're like, oh, that's cool. I bet this is okay, and then it's not remotely okay.
Yeah, that's the secret with Alchemy is anytime you think a card is okay, it's better than that. It's way better than that. Brave Meadowguard from Bloomburrow, 1 and a red for a 1/1 uncommon mouse soldier. When it enters, you conjure a card named Might of the Meek into your hand, which is single red mana for what does it do? It gives a creature +1/+0 and trample if it's a mouse, and then it cantrips. So it's just like a cheap combat, like a really small combat trick that cantrips. But Brave Meadowguard also has Valiant. When you target it with a spell or ability for the first time each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So another Heartfire hero friend that also gives you a cantrip and target and spell in your hand. Very cool card. Like it's essentially a cantrip creature that gets bigger the same way Heartfire hero does, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, I asked to play this, and Tim told me it was way too good. I took him for his word on this one.
I don't know. I played. This was another one I played in like a midweek Magic, and I was like, Jesus Christ, why is this card so much better than it reads? 2 others to close out my list. Chittering Illuminator is a pretty recent one. I think it also got changed recently, so it's now green for a 2/2. And I think this is just a really clever use of the arena design space, which is why I wanted to mention this one. But this one is a rare. It says, as long as this card is the top card of your library, you may look at it anytime and you may cast it. So on Arena, like anytime this ends up being your top card, it'll just suddenly pop up and be like, oh, hey, Chittering Illuminator's on top of my library. You can cast it off the top of your library now. Like, here I am. It reminds me, you remember that Yu-Gi-Oh card Parasite that would like shuffle face up into your opponent's deck, and you would kind of like always know where it is because it's face up. It reminds me of that a little bit. It also says, as long as the top card of your library is a creature, you may look at it anytime and you may cast it. And that ability applies while the Illuminator is on board. So it's kind of cool. It lets you play creatures off the top of your library without actually like revealing them to your opponent. So you know when creatures are coming up, but your opponent doesn't. And this also comes off the top of your library as a free card, which is nice. And then to close out my list, maybe one of the most controversial like design cards from Jank Diver Gaming for the mainline cube, especially Tezzeret's Reckoning.
I love this card.
What was it? Was this from Neo? This was from Neo.
I think this was Neo Alchemy. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is 1 and a blue for an uncommon instant. Exile 3 random cards from your library face down and look at them. For as long as they remain exiled, you may play one of those cards. Which, again, if you wanted to add this to a paper cube, it works perfectly. There's nothing digital only about this. It is a fantastic card. So think Anticipate, or Experimental Augury, whatever, like a mini impulse of sorts, but you don't have to choose the card that you're going to cast right away. You get to kind of see how the game plays out and then cast the right one when it's right. The other two just remain exiled forever. You can't do anything with them, but you get to kind of like prolong the decision on which card you get to cast, and it plays out really, really well. This is an awesome card. I was wrong about there were some comparisons made in the past to different types of cards. I was wrong about it, but if you want a really cool control card or a spellsy type card that gives you a lot of flexibility, I highly recommend Tezzeret's Reckoning. It works, it's intuitive, and it's also just very, very powerful as far as a card selection tool goes. So those are 6 cards I wanted to highlight. There were more I could talk about, but obviously I'm getting rambly at this point. So I'll leave you with those. I will encourage arena drafters to try some of these if you feel like they're interested in designs, and don't dismiss them just because they have alchemy tags on them. Like, try things out. They work, they're cool,
yeah.
And some of them will do things that no other paper card can do. So
Tezzeret's Reckoning is one of those cards that I kind of forgot about, but definitely would be down to argue should be in the mainline queue. Just, I loved the card. Like, I think the flexibility on it was so good because it was the kind of card you could fire off at the end of your turn, and then if you were missing your land drop, you could have your land drop set up, but if you hit your land drop, a lot of times you got to get, some different value out of it. So it just has a lot of flexibility. This is a card I really think we'll see in paper here soon. Just exile top 3 cards in your library, and then you can play one of them.
I hope so. It's very cool. Teld, you listed a couple cards here that you wanted to shout out.
Yeah, so I have a few as well. So there's Highway Reaver. It's out of the new set. It's 4 mana, 2 red, black for a 4/4 with flying and start your engine. Whenever this card enters or attacks target creature in your graveyard without unearth, perpetually gains unearth, and it's equal to its mana cost. And then if you're at max speed, you can pay 0 for the first unearth ability you activate each turn. Just a cool little value card. I think it's the kind of card that it's not doable in paper, but it doesn't feel like it's something that is out of the bounds, if that makes sense, right? It's like, I don't know how you would implement this in paper, but it feels like it's close to a paper card.
Oh, you could tweak. This would be easy to tweak, right? All you would say is a target creature card in your graveyard gains unearth until end of turn, instead of perpetually gains unearth, and then everything else works intuitively.
Sure, yeah. The next one is actually the only incorporate card I really like, and maybe the only reason I like it is because it was part of the Johan Brawl deck that when I got to spike the Misery League. It was Mapping the Maze, so it's 1 and a blue for an instant, and it's choose an instant or sorcery in your hand or graveyard. It perpetually incorporates blue and gains when you cast the spell, draw a card, and then return a multicolor instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So it ends up being a 2-for-1, but it's this weird card that like makes a card multicolor if you use it on a non-blue card, but then also you need to have multicolor cards because this was part of a cycle that incorporated and did things with multicolor cards. Just a really interesting design that is nowhere near being doable in paper, and I think Incorporate generally was just convoluted, and this is like peak Incorporate being convoluted, but I also just kind of like it.
Yeah, this is a fiddly card to play with. It's fun to play with.
Yeah, it generates a lot of value too, which is nifty. And because it's perpetual, if you're able to do things like recast it out of the graveyard, buy it back later, you still get to keep triggering that draw card again, which could generate quite a bit of value. There's Motivated Muralist. So I mentioned, so it's 1 in a red for a 2/1 with Improvise, and when it enters, conjure a card name and Inspiring Statuary to your hand, which is the 3 mana Improvise card that gives your other non-artifact cards Improvise. So I mentioned I like cards that conjure unplayable cards, and this is just another one of those cards because like Inspiring Statuary is terrible, but and Motivated Muralist is also terrible, but the combination of the two might not be terrible. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's a 2 mana 2/1, sometimes a 1 mana 2/1 that draws you a card. Like the card is not anything particularly great, but if you're playing any sort of artifacts energies, like
yeah, it's kind of cool too with specifically it's a dwarf, so you could play it in your Magda tribal deck and you could tap your Magda. So next up is one of the cards from the original drop. It was one of my favorites, and I actually have 4 of these crafted on my client from where I tried to play a constructed deck with it. It's Grizzled Huntmaster. It's 1 green for a 4/3 human warrior, and when it ETBs, you may exile a creature card from your hand. If you do, you search your hand or library for any other cards of the same name, exile them, and then choose a creature card from outside the game and conjure a duplicate of it into your hand for each creature card exiled from your hand this way. So it kind of has like, it's kind of a Fauna Shaman card, but basically the idea is typically you played this in decks that had like a lot of tech cards in the sideboard, and you would use it to exile cards that are bad in a specific matchup or were like suboptimal. Like if you're playing against a control deck, maybe you had like a bear you didn't want, you could go get a good anti-control card. It just created this kind of like Fauna Shaman, Fae of Wishes style toolbox deck, which was really cool. It's very convoluted for what it actually does.
It is, yeah.
But nifty card I really like.
This was one of the ones that people really panned. Not like the concept is cool. Like, I'm gonna get rid of all copies of a card from my deck and replace them with copies of a card from my sideboard. Like, that's what it's trying to say, but like people were really just like, what is this text on this card, you know?
Yeah. Next up is Wingbright Thief. So it's 1 in a blue for a 2/2 flying enchantment bird glimmer. And when it ETBs, target opponent reveals each non-land card in their hand. You may choose one of them. That target perpetually gains. When you cast this spell, each opponent draws a card and gains 3 life. So kind of has like vibes of some of the various Meddling Mage, Elite Spellbinder type cards where it gives your opponent a mild downside for casting their best card.
This was a 3-mana 3/3, right? They bumped it down to a 2-mana 2/2.
3-mana 2/3.
Oh, okay. So they made it cheaper, which is kind of cool.
They did, and I think it's still not crazy good, but like I think now it's probably good enough that you could definitely run and it would be annoying. Notably kind of good against Core Skyfisher decks because you can put it on the target that you know they're going to want to Core Skyfisher, and then if they want to do that, you'll get to draw a bunch of cards. I like this card. I like these sort of disruptive tempo flyer cards. This one's not really disruptive, I guess. It gives you more of the generating value for you, which is kind of against what these decks are trying to do sometimes, but still a good card. And then finally is one of my favorite alchemy designs is Overcooked. So it's 2 in a red for an enchantment. Players can't gain life. And Celebration, which is where 2 or more permanents interplay. At the beginning of your end step, create a food token. If 2 or more non-land permanents enter the battlefield under your control this turn, instead conjure a card named Food Fight onto the battlefield. This is a very, very silly card because you can't gain life while it's in play, but the food tokens don't do anything except be artifact triggers. But you can very easily get multiple copies of Food Fight into play with this card. And once you're doing that, this card is a total engine that will just straight up kill your opponent. But it's a funny card. Like I think it's one of those like alchemy schlock super powerful cards, but I really like it. It's a card that I refuse to play it, but it's in the Holiday Cube and it's very good there because that cube just doesn't have good cards. This is a very good card.
The flavor of this card too is it's pretty peak, right? Because like the art is like a burnt pig's head and stuff. Like,
yeah, like the food
it's overcooked. So the food's not edible, so you can't gain life off the food. But and then you're creating food fights because it's just a bunch of burnt food everywhere. Like, and Food Fight, for those who don't know, was an enchantment that lets you sack artifacts to deal damage, but you dealt more damage if you controlled more copies of the card Food Fight in play. So like this just creates more food fights over time, creates these foods that you can't really do anything with other than throw them at other creatures. It is a really fun card. It's a powerful card. It's a very powerful card. Plus, like, players can't gain life just tacked onto things is like, obviously it's here for the joke, but it also just shuts down your opponent's stuff sometimes. So
yeah, it also has a number of like little synergies with artifact ETB triggers, enchantment ETB triggers, sack triggers. There's a bunch of different stuff that this card is doing. Again, very, very powerful card, but also just silly and very good flavor. The art is really something, but like it's not actually that bad. So yeah, just there are a lot of cool alchemy designs. I think that people have been hating on it, right? Sometimes rightfully so, but I think sometimes it's just the bandwagon of Magic players complaining about things because other people are complaining about it. I think we need to get over that and start trying to embrace some of the better designs, at least in the digital client where we can play them.
Yeah, I mean, the overall, bow I want to put on this is for the cube designers. Like, who cares that this is part of Brawl or part of Historic, or like you don't like the alchemy format? Who cares? Like, you're a cube designer. You're making cubes. You get to hand select. Like, do you have cards in your cube from sets you don't like? Like, I absolutely despise Foundations, but I'm not going to like not put cards from Foundations in my cube because I don't like the set Foundations, right? I'm going to play the good cards from Foundations. So like, why limit yourself, with the cards available to you if they're going to add something to your cube. I'm not saying you have to rework a bunch of alchemy cards into your cube if you think that they're detrimental, but you get to pick and choose. Like, you get to add Dragonfly Pilot, I think, is the only alchemy card in our Peasant cube right now. So
yeah, and I'm not even sure we're running any in the mainline cube at the moment. We might be, but
yeah, with Talion's Throne Guard out, we're probably not, but we could easily run a Tezzeret's Ambition or whatever it's called, Tezzeret's Reckoning. That could just be in our mainline cube. Like, it's a good card.
Yeah, I mean, and some of it too is like what, you know, because we designed as a group. You know, I know Chris is this episode would probably be a little more let's say antagonistic where Chris here today, because he's definitely more in the alchemy bad camp, but like that's okay. But he's willing to accept cards that are that when it's a good fit. So I think that it's more, I would say it's more incidental that we're not running a lot of alchemy cards or not running any alchemy cards maybe in the mainline cube, as opposed to some sort of matter of principle.
Mm-hmm. And we easily could. I mean, I think our 450 Peasant Cube actually has that rat that like conjures a think twice into your graveyard. There was like a Knight's Whisper at instant speed that had a drawback to it that we played for quite a while. I think that's a perfectly serviceable card. Like, there's a lot that you're missing out on as potential cards if you just like say, I'm not engaging with alchemy at all, I don't like alchemy. Like, you're missing out on something as a cube designer, and maybe your players are missing out on something. They might be vocal about it, like, oh, this is alchemy bad, but like they'll get over it if they play with the card and they think it's really fun. I think that's the case with Dragonfly Pilot, and I think that could be the case with other cards if you mark them as like appropriate for your power level. I would not power max at Peasant for alchemy cards though, unless you're fine with the alchemy cards just being better than everything else in your cube, because that's how they play.
If so, come play the Timeless Peasant Cube. You can play with all the alchemy schlock you want.
I also, we haven't fired it, but and we probably never will, but I also have an alchemy cube that is just 360 alchemy cards. But the problem with that is, A, nobody wants to play that cube, and B, like, the wild card situation is just stupid because nobody actually has alchemy cards unless they have to craft them. So, yeah, so this is all to say, like, try things out. We would highly recommend that you just poke through some of the existing alchemy sets and see if there are designs that are additive. And if you're a paper cuber and some of these cards strike your fancy, like, you can make them work. Like, get a nice proxy done of Combi of Bamboo or whatever it's called and make it work. It's functional. Some of these cards are intuitive. People will figure it out. And if you have to tweak things and just tell your players about it, like, they might have fun with these cards. So don't limit yourself too much on the alchemy stuff if you want to play with these cards in paper, though obviously there are natural limitations to some of the stuff, like perpetual gains and, you know, conjuring cards out of thin air from an opponent's library. You can't do stuff like that. So give it a second look is all I would say. Give it a second look, and hopefully the design team continues to do good work with the more recent alchemy stuff, and we can kind of let the alchemy hate go. Let it go. It's time to let it go and just embrace the good stuff about it. So unless you have any closing thoughts, that's going to go ahead and do it for us here. Remember, you can find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on twitch.tv/TeldTalks. Tarkir Dragonstorm, I think, comes out in a little less than a month. A spoiler season starts on the 18th, so I believe we should have one more non-review episode between now and then before we do our Tarkir Dragonstorm review, and hopefully we can get Chris back on with us and bring the hate back, bring the
yeah. So join us next time when you can find out why having a Boggles or Storm archetype in your cube is a good decision.
Well, actually, we can have you seen the Storm Dragon? We can put Storm in the mainline cube now. Anyway, that's going to go ahead and do it for this one. As always, thanks for listening to the two people who didn't immediately click off an alchemy-related cube episode.
Yeah.
So
something tells me the views and retention rate on this one's going to be a little lower than normal.
Hey, maybe we can do our part and convince people to try these cards out. I don't know. But thanks for listening, everybody. Join us next time, and we will see you all later. Okay, I've got a farewell here. I've got a little sign off.
So what are we selecting? Is it boards, graveyards, artifacts, enchantments?
Yeah, all of the above. Always all of the above. Got to make the game last for 2 more hours. Obviously we can't do a bash Chris farewell. that's not fair. But I identified a leak in my limited gameplay recently, which is not something that comes up too often. Like, I'm not a perfect player, but like when you actually like sit back and think like, oh, there's something I'm doing in limited that I could fix or address, like, I think that's interesting. Gives you opportunity to play. I've been playing very sloppy over the last couple of years because of how much I play on Arena and not playing for stakes. So like that's obviously a leak, but I wanted to chat just very quickly about Ether Drift Draft and what happened to make me kind of like realize this. So I think Teld can agree. Ether Drift is not a great set. It's hardly even a good set. Like, I enjoy it, but it's not a good limited set. It's got too many flaws.
Yeah, I haven't played it in a couple of weeks, so if there's any major meta shifts, are we still just drafting green value piles?
There is some meta shifting. In fact, at the Pro Tour, there was a lot of like talk about white being something you wanted to do because of how contested green was. But here's what happened. So Ether Drift came out within a week. Before a week, it was very, very, very clear to everybody that green was the best color in the set.
Literally day one.
Yeah. And it wasn't even like a data thing this time. It was just if you played two drafts, like, it was very clear that green cards were dictating the pace of the game. There's a benchmark card in Migrate and Ketradon, which is the 6-mana 6/6 gain 4 life on ETB. It has reach, it cycles. Basically, the question you have to ask yourself during the draft is like, can my deck beat Migrate and Ketradon? If not, you should not expect your deck to do very well.
Yeah, this is like usually our draft server, to put it in perspective. We have a bunch of pretty good players, and we're usually like a week ahead of the meta. So we're usually like week one, you're playing against a bunch of random stuff. It takes a little while for the limited podcasters to come in and tell people what to play. And we're kind of ahead of the game. We find the specific tech cards that are really good. Not that we're like the best draft server ever or anything, but we're definitely above average. And it was clear by like day 2, day 3 that the average Magic Arena population had caught on that green was just what you wanted to be doing. You played against almost all green decks, even in lower levels of play.
Exactly. So my approach to this sort of thing is, when I'm drafting a set like this, where it's very clear that one color is better than the other, I tend to avoid that color. I tend to want to be in like whatever the tier 1.5 or tier 2 deck is that would be more open than fight with 4 other drafters over that color. And the thing that dawned on me is this same exact thing happened last year with OTJ. If you remember OTJ, it wasn't as, what's the word I'm looking
prevalent, noticeable.
Yeah, like, it was very clear that green was the best color. It also had a benchmark in Cactarantula, I believe, was like the kind of like, can my deck beat Cactarantula? If no, then right-click concede. And I realized, like, what I was doing in OTJ and the advice I was giving people, which might have been bad advice, is if you don't have an extremely strong pool into green for these sets, try to draft a different color and let the rest of the table draft over green. And that's kind of like a philosophy that I've had for a long time. Except I realized with Ether Drift that no matter how many times I did that, and no matter how many tables you were at where people were clearly fighting over green, when it comes to playing your matches, you still just play against good green decks constantly because the card quality is so high that even if 3 people were fighting over green, 3 people can still walk away with good green decks. So what dawned on me is, like, I'm avoiding this color to try and get into a deck that would be more open, but I'm still constantly playing against good versions of this deck because that's how deep the color is. So why am I not giving myself the opportunity to draft the best deck in these formats? Like, why am I avoiding it so hard when it's clear that you can still get a average to above average deck in these colors if you're willing to fight over it? And I think that is a leak.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. If you want to finish.
No, just to finish that thought, I think that is a leak in my play, is that I'm not giving myself opportunities to be in the best deck often enough.
Sure.
I'm avoiding it too hard and not willing to fight the fight to be in the deck because it's clear that other people still end up in that deck. It's clear it comes together enough of the time that, like, I should be willing to fight over the color some amount of the time, not every time. Like, maybe I need to start in the color more often and then be willing to just abandon it rather than not fight for it from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I think what I would say about this too is I think at OTJ, like you said, it wasn't quite as prevalent, and I think it was more common in OTJ to be like third pack one, pick three, pick four, greens dried up, right? And you just recognize that you were super cut. And on top of that, in OTJ, you had one, rares define the format. So if you opened a good rare in any color, you could just build towards that. And there were multiple archetypes that were, I think, just as good as the green decks. Like, obviously, Abzan was the best thing to be doing in that format, but I don't think the blue-black crimes decks or the white-black grind attrition aggro decks, I don't call it the aggro deck feels weird, mid-range deck maybe, the reckless lawbringer decks were all very good. And like, for example, most of my time in OTJ was spent drafting the crimes deck because you could just get it. It was open and it was basically as good as the Abzan decks if they were contested. I don't think that my limited experience of Aether Drift and having watched people play it, it doesn't feel like that's the case here. It feels like you probably are better off just trying to, because the format's not particularly aggressive, it's very slow, and it's very value oriented, just play the good green cards and then splash as much as you need to fit in the rest of your deck, like if green is kind of cut. But it feels like passing up on the green cards in this particular set is such a big difference because the green cards across all the features of the format are better. Like if you were playing in OTJ and you saw a giant beaver, you really didn't care unless you were the green white mount deck, right? Like it was a fine card you might play as a 23rd card in your green black deck, but it wasn't premium. Whereas something like Hazard of the Dunes is just fantastic in every green deck or in every deck in Aether Drift.
Or so I think or the worst green card in Aether Drift is probably like Alacrian Tiger, which is not a good card, but is still not even in like the worst card is still like not the most embarrassing card you can put in a deck. Yeah,
this is a format with like red 1/1s that die on turn 2. You know, they're bricked on turn 2. Yeah. This is like, I think Aether Drift feels to me, again, I haven't played very much, but just having looked at it again, it feels like one of those polarized, color polarized formats since maybe Phyrexia All-in One.
Mm. It's, everybody knows it. Everybody's known it the whole time. And it's like, the type of thing that'll happen is, I'll open a pack one, pick one, where the best card in the pack is like Earth Rumbler, for example, which is an excellent card in the limited format. Or let's say Thunder and Brood Buggy or whatever it is, the green, black uncommon is like one of the best uncommons in the set. And then the second best card will be like a Lightning Strike or a Packdoll Terror or something like that. And I've been leaning towards like, let me take the Packdoll Terror, which is a key part of another really good deck, but obviously worse than Thunder and Brood Buggy because I don't want to fight over green. And I think I'm supposed to be taking Thunder and Brood Buggy, and then if green is not open in 3 pick, like if there's 0 green cards 4 picks down the line, I pivot instead of being like, okay, I'm not going to take the Thunder and Brood Buggy because I don't want to fight over green, and then I never end up in the best deck.
Yeah, and then I think, too, the other thing is it feels like the decks that aren't green in Drift are very pigeonholed to a very specific thing. Like, the Packdoll Terror is great, but if you aren't able to make your deck mostly artifacts, which is a very specific deck with no off-ramp, your deck isn't very good.
Yeah. It's an easy deck to get cut on, too. Like, you know, like sometimes you get rewarded and you get past Haunt the Network 4th pick or something, but sometimes you go deep on artifacts and it's not open. And Brood Buggy, like even a mediocre black-green deck is still going to play Brood Buggy, and you'll still get playables because the playables are deep. So
and then the fixing is so good that you could just, like I talked about earlier, you could just splash all the, like if you need to splash like 3 or 4 cards in the set, it's slow and the fixing is great. So
so I again, just to kind of, this doesn't translate to cube that well because I don't think like our cubes, I should say, there's not like that color imbalance, but the equivalent would have been like vintage cube 7-8 years ago when it was just understood by everybody that blue was the best color in vintage cube, which is not the case anymore. But like my approach to that sort of thing was, obviously if I open Ancestral Recall, I take Ancestral Recall, but if the best card in the pack 7 years ago was a Cryptic Command or something like that, I'd be like, I don't want to draft blue because I know 5 other people at this table are trying to draft blue. But then I never end up in a blue deck when blue is the best thing to be doing. So I think this was a leak that kind of dawned on me because it was so clear in Aether Drift that there was a best color and that other people's decks that I was playing against were able to just cobble together good decks regardless of how cut it was. And B, that this is like the second time in less than a year that this has happened with a lot of stuff in Aether Drift mimicking OTJ. And it dawned on me as like, oh, I'm doing the same thing in this set that I did in that set. and this is a pattern at this point. Like, I'm not getting into the best deck ever. Sometimes it won't work out, right? Like, sometimes you first pick Scurryfoot into Hazard of the Dunes, and then there's no green, and you have to jump ship. You're not going to end up in the best deck every time, but I need to give myself more opportunities to be in the best deck rather than just avoiding it from the beginning.
Yeah, you're kind of capping your ceiling in an attempt to raise your floor.
Yeah. So I thought that was something interesting to bring up that I haven't really shared with anybody yet. So I don't really have actionable advice for other people other than, like, give yourself the opportunity to be in the best deck some amount of time. Like, somebody's got to be in green. You know, they say this on limited resources, or not limited resources, but Lords of Limited. They're like, somebody has to be in green. Why can't it be me some amount of the time, you know?
Yeah. And I think, like, I was probably closer to the other side of the spectrum where I was a little too willing to just be like, all right, whatever. There's a Cactarantula in this pack. I'll fight over green.
Just the best thing. Just the best thing. I'll take it.
I'll just take best card available. Yeah. And I think, like, having talked to you about it, I've probably not come around to your position, but we're probably meeting somewhere closer in the middle now where, like, yeah, like, I'm not fighting over a Cactarantula as often, but I'm also, you know, and you're not just giving up on it immediately. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I think it's one of the advantages too of drafting in pod, or like in, like, people, just having people sit there and draft with you, because you hear everybody's perspectives and you start, like, I think it sometimes you get too many cooks in the kitchen, but I think a lot of times it makes us draft better because we consider things that maybe we would miss. Because, like, I'm known for, I would say at this point, probably known for just, like, I've got a Prophetic Prism, the mana will work out. Like, you know, just I'm going to splash for best card available really aggressively.
Yeah, you know that meme of the guy slapping, like, duct tape on the a picture of the weakened water
or whatever.
Yeah, and he slapped an Evolving Wilds on it, and he was like, my 17 land mana base with 5 splashes and 1 Evolving Wilds or whatever.
That's me. Yeah.
So yeah, that was just something I wanted to bring up there from the limited perspective. Doesn't apply to Cube too much, but I thought it was something neat that popped in my head the other night, and I felt like sharing that. So. Hey guys, I'm pretty excited to play some Commander for the first time. I've got to let you all know that I'm new to the format. I just bought this Commander precon from the store, so bear with me while I learn all the cards and interactions and everything, okay? Oh, hey, no problem. Always great to have a new Commander player in the group, and you've got a precon deck, so you're a perfect fit for Bracket 2. Bracket 2? What do you mean by Bracket 2? Oh, it's not really a big deal. You'll learn about these as you play more, but they recently released this bracket system where you can kind of gauge the power level of your decks compared to other people. It helps people find opponents who are playing decks with similar goals, but it's a fairly new system, so we're all kind of getting used to it. Okay, so a Commander precon is in Bracket 2. Well, what's Bracket 1? Oh, Bracket 1's for super casual decks. Decks that are often underpowered or trying to do something gimmicky, but ones that aren't playing too competitively. Okay, that makes sense. So Bracket 1 is slightly weaker than a precon, and I'm guessing Bracket 3 is slightly stronger? Yeah, that's right. Bracket 3 is called the upgraded bracket. You still can't play any super efficient infinite combos or a bunch of extra turn spells, but your deck is a little stronger than the average precon, and you can start playing game changers, up to 3 per deck in this bracket. Game changers? Oh, yeah, right. Game changers are another part of the bracket system. It's a list of cards that are really, really strong and sometimes game warping, but not exactly bannable. Bracket 3 is basically defined as the bracket where you can start including game changers, but a maximum of 3 per deck. Okay, guess I'll have to learn about game changers too. Okay, brackets 1 through 3, got it. Well, wait just a second, there's a few more brackets you need to know about. Oh, it goes past Bracket 3. Okay, what's above that? Well, you also have Bracket 4 and 5. Bracket 4 is called the Optimized Bracket, and Bracket 5 is CEDH. Okay, I know CEDH means Competitive Commander, but what's the difference between those brackets? Honestly, not that much. There's no real limitation on Bracket 4. You can play as many game changers as you'd like, and the restrictions on infinite turns and combos are lifted. So what about Bracket 5, the CEDH bracket? Well, there's nothing really outlined about it, but you'll just know when you play a Bracket 5 deck. Basically, if no one does anything for the first 4 turns, that's a Bracket 5 deck. Okay, that's quite a bit to take in for my first time, but I'll do my best to learn as I go. Thanks for showing me the ropes. I hope we can have a fun game. Then after that, there's Bracket 6. Oh, there's more brackets past Bracket 5. 6 is called Hell Q. It's where you're allowed to play Silver Border Acorn stamped Alchemy cards, as well as custom cards you've printed out on the custom MTG card subreddit. Wait, is that real, or are you... And after that, we've got bracket 7. In bracket 7, all food tokens are treated as treasure tokens, and you can tap lands in your graveyard for mana. I don't understand. That seems like a big logistical nightmare. Next up is bracket 8, which can only be played between the hours of 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. standard time, and only on a wax and gibbous. Okay, this is getting out of hand. I don't really think Commander's going to be for me if this is... Bracket 10. Oh, bracket 10. That's where things get crazy. In bracket 10, you have to play all your cards in rhythm to the song Knick Knack Paddywhack, and if you play offbeat, your opponent's life points are doubled. Additionally, you're allowed to play up to 5 cards from other TCGs, except for Weiss Schwartz. What? Wait a second. What happened to bracket 9? There is no bracket 9. Now, bracket 11 introduces the Ass Kickers list. You thought Game Changers were bad? Wait till you get a load of ass kickers. Oh my god, what's an ass kicker? Prophet of Krufix, that's what. Bracket 12 is just matches of Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelist Kingdom rules. No, that's totally unfair. Well, you know what they say. Fairness in Magic is like a gear hulk. It's just a construct. I've never heard anyone say that before. Bracket 13 is the only bracket where it's socially acceptable to be on your cell phone during other players' turns. Holy shit. In bracket 14, you'll be under the omniscient watch of Hemephapalites himself, diviner of truths and reaper of souls. Losing a match in bracket 14 means losing your very existence. All shall bow before the will of Hemephapalites. Look, I'm done here. This is crazy. Finally, we have bracket 15, which transcends space and time itself. There are no rules, no restrictions, no tangibility or definition whatsoever, simply a void of unending nothingness swallowed by an abyss of non-existence. All right, did you get all that? Like I said, you'll learn the brackets as you go. It takes a little bit of time. What the hell was that? Nothing, man. Like I said, we're all getting used to the brackets. I'm going to go ahead and play my casual Keenan Bonder Prodigy deck with 2 Game Changers and 1 Ass Kicker. Roll 2 d6s to see who goes first. I'm going to go back to playing Pauper.